Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight, we embark on a peaceful journey through the extraordinary life and dramatic end of one of England's most legendary kings, Richard the Lionheart, the warrior king whose life was defined by adventure, crusade, and ultimately a violent battlefield death that would echo through the centuries. We'll softly explore the rise of this Plantagenet prince from rebellious youth to crusading legend, from his dramatic victories in the Holy Land to his final fatal siege in the French countryside, all while the gentle rhythms of medieval life carry you toward restful sleep. Before you drift away into peaceful slumber, please take a moment to like this video if you're enjoying these soothing tales from the past. I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Don't be shy. Share what draws you to these medieval stories, or perhaps tell us about your favorite historical figure. Your thoughts mean the world to our growing Sleepy Crown family. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to keep these gentle historical journeys coming your way. We have so many more peaceful tales waiting to lull you into dreamland. So cozy up under your blanket, close your eyes, and let these gentle whispers from the 12th century carry you softly towards sleep. If you're new here, welcome to the Sleepy Crown family. Tonight, we'll walk alongside the legendary Lionheart through castle corridors, across crusading battlefields, and into the quiet chambers where great kings draw their final breath. Richard, later known as King Richard I of England and called the Lionheart for his courage and ferocity in battle, entered this world on September 8, 1157, in the peaceful halls of Beaumont Palace in Oxford. The autumn air carried the promise of greatness as Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women in medieval Europe, welcomed her third son into the sprawling Plantagenet dynasty. Picture, if you will, the soft candlelight flickering against stone walls as baby Richard drew his first breath. The palace rooms were filled with the gentle murmur of courtiers and the rustle of silk gowns, while outside, the English countryside settled into the golden colours of harvest time. Eleanor, already mother to young Henry and William, looked upon this new child with particular tenderness, perhaps sensing even then that this boy would capture her heart in ways that would shape the destiny of kingdoms. The world Richard entered was one of constant motion and political intrigue. His father, Henry II, ruled an empire that stretched from the Scottish borders to the Pyrenees, a realm so vast that the king spent his days riding from castle to castle, never staying in one place for more than a few weeks. The Plantagenet court was a travelling circus of nobles, clerks, soldiers and servants, moving like a great river across the landscape of medieval Europe. In these early years, as baby Richard grew into a curious toddler, the palace chambers echoed with the sounds of a bustling royal household. Nurses sang gentle lullabies in Norman French, their voices blending with the distant sounds of horses in the courtyard and the soft chanting of monks in the castle chapel. The young prince's days were filled with the simple pleasures of childhood: warm milk sweetened with honey, soft wool blankets, and the comforting presence of his devoted wet nurse, Hodierna of St. Albans, whose gentle care would earn her Richard's lifelong gratitude and a generous pension in later years. As Richard took his first steps across the polished stone floors, his distinctive red-gold hair caught the light streaming through tall windows. Even as a child, there was something remarkable about his bearing, a natural confidence that seemed to emanate from his very soul. The court chroniclers would later write that he possessed an almost magical charisma, drawing people to him like moths to a flame. The relationship between Richard and his mother Eleanor was extraordinary, even by medieval standards. Eleanor of Aquitaine was no ordinary queen. She was a patron of troubadours, a veteran of the Second Crusade, and a political force in her own right. In the quiet moments between court ceremonies and state business, she would take young Richard onto her lap and tell him stories of distant lands, of the holy city of Jerusalem, and of the chivalric ideals that should guide a true knight. These intimate mother-son conversations, conducted in the soft light of evening fires, planted seeds that would bloom into Richard's later obsession with crusading glory. Eleanor spoke of honor and adventure, of the duty of Christian knights to protect the holy places, and of the romance of distant battles fought under foreign stars. As Richard listened, his young mind painted vivid pictures of himself as a great warrior, leading armies across desert sands toward Jerusalem's golden walls. But the young prince's childhood was not all peaceful stories and maternal affection. The Plantagenet household was a place of barely contained tensions, where family members schemed against each other with the casual ruthlessness of medieval politics. Henry II, Richard's father, was a man of explosive temper and relentless energy, who demanded absolute obedience from his sons, while simultaneously setting them against each other in a complex game of dynastic chess. The gentle rhythm of palace life was often disrupted by sudden departures and urgent counsels. Messengers would arrive at all hours, their horses lathered with sweat, bearing news of rebellions in distant provinces or threats from neighboring kingdoms. Young Richard learned to read these signs early, understanding that power was something that had to be constantly defended, never simply enjoyed. As Richard grew from toddler to boy, his education began in earnest. Medieval childhood ended early for princes, and by the Yiminte, age of 7, Richard was receiving instruction in the arts of war and governance. His tutors were learned men who taught him to read and write in Latin, Norman French, and the Occitan language of his mother's southern French domains. But perhaps more importantly, he learned the fundamental skills of medieval nobility: how to ride a horse with grace and power, how to handle sword and lance, and how to command men in battle. The castle courtyards rang with the sound of wooden practice swords as young Richard sparred with other noble boys. Even in these childhood games, his natural talent for warfare began to emerge. He moved with a fluid grace that seemed almost supernatural, and his strategic mind grasped the complexities of combat tactics with an ease that amazed his instructors. The master-at-arms would often pause their lessons simply to watch Richard demonstrate a particularly complex sword technique, recognizing that they were witnessing the development of a truly exceptional warrior. But Richard's childhood was also marked by the constant absence of his father. Henry II was always traveling, always campaigning, always dealing with some crisis in his vast empire. This absence created a void in Richard's young life that was filled increasingly by his mother's influence and by his own developing sense of independence. Unlike his older brother Henry, who seemed content to wait for his inheritance, Richard displayed an early hunger for action and authority. The defining moment of Richard's youth came when he was still just a boy of 11 years. In 1168, Eleanor made the momentous decision to take Richard with her to Aquitaine, the vast duchy that formed her inheritance and would one day be his to rule. This journey south from the grey castles of England to the sun-drenched vineyards and olive groves of southern France was like entering another world entirely. Aquitaine was a land of troubadours and courtly love, where the harsh military culture of Norman England gave way to something more refined and artistic. Here, in the great halls of Poitiers, Richard encountered a different model of nobility, one that valued not just strength and cunning, but also poetry, music, and the elegant art of chivalric romance. The young prince absorbed these lessons eagerly, developing the sophisticated cultural awareness that would later make him a hero of romantic literature. The countryside of Aquitaine worked its magic on the young prince's imagination. Here were castles perched on rocky promontories overlooking rivers that had flowed since ancient times. Here were markets filled with spices from distant lands and merchants who spoke of adventures in far-off kingdoms. The very air seemed to whisper of possibilities, of adventures waiting beyond the horizon. Eleanor established her court at Poitiers, creating what many historians consider the first truly sophisticated centre of medieval culture. Troubadours came from across Europe to perform their songs of love and adventure, while scholars debated questions of philosophy and theology. Young Richard moved through this world like a prince from a fairy tale, absorbing not just the practical lessons of rulership, but also the romantic ideals that would guide his later life. It was here in Aquitaine that Richard first truly understood what it meant to be a ruler. At the age of 14, in a ceremony that would have brought tears to the eyes of any observer, he was formally invested as Duke of Aquitaine and Count of Poitou. The great cathedral of Poitiers was filled with nobles and bishops as Richard knelt before the altar, receiving the lance and banner that symbolized his authority over millions of people. But even this moment of triumph was tinged with the political complexities that would define Richard's entire life. His investiture was not just a celebration, it was also a strategic move in the endless chess game of medieval politics. By establishing Richard as Duke of Aquitaine, Eleanor was ensuring that her vast inheritance would remain separate from the main Plantagenet domains, preserving the unique culture and independence of the southern French territories. The young Duke threw himself into his new responsibilities with characteristic intensity. He travelled throughout Aquitaine, learning the names of his major vassals, understanding the complex web of alliances and feuds that govern local politics, and gradually building the reputation that would serve him so well in later years. Even as a teenager, Richard displayed an uncanny ability to inspire loyalty in his followers, while simultaneously intimidating his enemies. Yet beneath the pageantry and political manoeuvring, tensions within the Plantagenet family continued to simmer. Henry II had divided his vast empire among his sons, but he maintained ultimate authority over all of them, creating a situation that bred resentment and rebellion. Young Henry, the eldest, had been crowned as heir to England and Normandy, while Geoffrey had been designated as future Duke of Brittany. But all three brothers chafed under their father's continuing control, yearning for real power rather than empty titles. The explosion, when it came, would reshape the political landscape of Western Europe and provide young Richard with his first real taste of warfare. But for now, in these peaceful moments before the storm, the teenage Duke of Aquitaine could enjoy the simple pleasures of his new position, riding through vineyards heavy with grapes, holding court in ancient Roman amphitheatres, and listening to troubadours sing of heroes and adventures under the star-filled southern sky. As winter gave way to spring in the year 1173, Richard had no way of knowing that his childhood was about to end forever, that within months he would be leading armies in rebellion against his own father, or that the seeds of his legendary reputation were about to sprout in the bloody soil of civil war. For now, he was simply a young man coming into his power, beloved by his mother, admired by his followers, and dreaming of the great deeds that lay ahead. The gentle sounds of the Aquitanian countryside, the lowing of cattle, the ring of church bells across the hills, the distant sound of shepherds calling to their flocks, would remain with Richard for the rest of his life, a peaceful memory to contrast with the clash of steel and the cries of battle that would soon define his existence. In quiet moments during future campaigns, he would close his eyes and remember these golden days of youth, when the world seemed full of infinite possibility and the future stretched ahead like an open road leading toward adventure and glory. The year 1187 dawned with an ominous stillness across the Christian world, like the calm before a terrible storm. In the great halls of European castles, nobles went about their daily routines, hunting in forest glades, holding court in torch-lit chambers, and planning the eternal dance of medieval politics. Yet beneath this surface tranquility, events were unfolding in the distant Holy Land that would soon shatter the peace and call forth the greatest military expedition of the age. On July 4th, 1187, under the blazing sun of Palestine, the army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem met its doom at the twin hills called the Horns of Hattin. The Christian forces, led by the hapless King Guy of Lusignan, had been lured into the desert by the brilliant Muslim commander Saladin, and there, surrounded and dying of thirst, they were systematically destroyed. The flower of Christian knighthood perished in that battle, and with them died the military power that had protected the Crusader states for nearly a century. The news travelled slowly across the medieval world, carried by exhausted messengers who rode their horses to death in their haste to spread the terrible tidings. In monastery scriptoriums, monks laid down their pens and wept as they heard how the true cross, that most sacred of relics, supposedly made from the wood of Christ's crucifixion, had been captured by Saladin's forces. In castle halls, hardened warriors fell silent as they learned the names of friends and kinsmen who would never return from the Holy Land. But it was the fall of Jerusalem itself, on October 2nd, 1187, that truly galvanized the Christian world into action. The holy city, for which so much blood had been shed, around which so many dreams had been woven, was once again in Muslim hands. Saladin, in a gesture of mercy that contrasted sharply with the massacre that had accompanied the Christian conquest nearly a century earlier, allowed the inhabitants to ransom themselves and depart safely. But for Christians across Europe, the loss was devastating beyond measure. The news reached the papal court like a thunderbolt. Pope Urban III, already an elderly man, was said to have collapsed upon hearing the reports from the Holy Land. Whether his death was truly caused by grief, as the chroniclers claimed, or merely by the coincidence of age and illness, the symbolism was powerful. The very head of Christendom had been struck down by news of this disaster. Urban's successor, Gregory VIII, was a man of different temperament entirely. Where Urban had been scholarly and contemplative, Gregory burned with the fire of righteous indignation. On October 29th, 1187, barely weeks after assuming the papal throne, he issued the bull Audita Tremendi, calling upon all of Christian Europe to take up arms in a new crusade to reclaim the Holy Land. The bull was a masterpiece of medieval rhetoric, calculated to stir the hearts and consciences of a warrior society. Gregory proclaimed that the loss of Jerusalem was not merely a military defeat, but a divine punishment for the sins of Christendom. Only through the purification of crusade, only through the willing sacrifice of blood and treasure in God's service, could Christians hope to regain divine favor and reclaim the holy places. Copies of Audita Tremendi spread across Europe like wildfire, carried by papal legates and preaching friars to every corner of the Christian world. In village churches, priests read the papal call to their congregations by candlelight, their voices echoing off stone walls as they described the suffering of their fellow Christians in the East. In castle chapels, court chaplains delivered sermons that brought tears to the eyes of hardened knights, reminding them of their duty to defend the holy places where Christ himself had walked. The response was electric. Across the continent, men began to take the cross, sewing crosses onto their clothing as a sign of their commitment to the holy war. But this time, unlike previous crusades, the call was answered not just by landless knights seeking fortune and adventure, but by the greatest rulers of the age. For the first time in crusading history, reigning kings would lead their armies to the Holy Land. The first to respond was the Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, the aging but still formidable ruler of the Holy Roman Empire. Frederick was nearly 70 years old, his red beard now white with age, but the fire of crusading zeal still burned bright in his heart. He had dreamed of crusade for decades, and now, in what he knew might be his final great adventure, he began assembling what would become the largest army ever to march overland to the Holy Land. In France, the news of Jerusalem's fall reached King Philip II, called Philip Augustus, as he was engaged in his eternal struggle with the Plantagenet domains. Philip was a calculating ruler, more concerned with expanding his kingdom than with distant adventures, but even he could not ignore the moral imperative of the crusade. Moreover, the political advantages of crusading were obvious. A successful expedition would enhance his prestige and provide opportunities to weaken his enemies. But it was in the Plantagenet lands that the call to crusade found its most dramatic response. Henry II of England, Richard's father, was now an old man, worn down by decades of ruling his vast empire and fighting rebellious sons. When the news from the Holy Land reached him, Henry initially hesitated. He was engaged in yet another war with Philip of France. His treasury was strained, and he had little appetite for distant adventures. Richard, however, heard the call to crusade with ears attuned to its every nuance. Now 30 years old and Duke of Aquitaine, he had spent the previous decade and a half establishing his reputation as one of Europe's finest military commanders. He had crushed rebellion after rebellion in his duchy, earning a fearsome reputation for both strategic brilliance and personal courage in battle. The troubadours sang of his exploits, comparing him to the heroes of ancient Rome and the paladins of Charlemagne. But for all his military success, Richard was haunted by a sense that his true destiny lay elsewhere. The routine of suppressing baronial revolts and administering his duchy, while necessary, seemed somehow beneath his talents. He dreamed of greater things, of adventures worthy of the songs that troubadours would sing for generations to come. The call to crusade spoke to every aspect of Richard's complex personality. Here was a cause that combined military adventure with religious duty, that promised glory in this world and salvation in the next. Here was an opportunity to test himself against the greatest Muslim commander of the age, to win renown that would echo through the centuries, and to achieve something truly worthy of his royal blood. The transformation in Richard when he heard the crusading call was remarkable to behold. Where before he had been restless and somewhat aimless, now he burned with focused intensity. He began immediately to plan for his participation in the expedition, throwing himself into the logistical challenges with the same thoroughness he had once applied to siege warfare in Aquitaine. But first, there was the matter of his father's approval. Henry II was initially skeptical of Richard's crusading enthusiasm, suspecting that it might be simply another excuse for his son to escape his control and seek independent glory. The relationship between father and son had always been complex, marked by mutual respect, but also by the underlying tension that came from Henry's refusal to grant Richard real autonomy in his own duchy. The breakthrough came in January 1188 at a conference between Henry II and Philip Augustus at Gisors. The two kings had met to discuss their ongoing territorial disputes, but the conversation inevitably turned to the crisis in the Holy Land. Philip, perhaps genuinely moved by crusading fervour, or perhaps simply seeking to place moral pressure on his enemy, dramatically took the cross before the assembled nobles. The moment hung in the balance. Henry II found himself in an impossible position. To refuse the cross now would be to appear less devout than his rival, but to accept it would commit him to a ruinously expensive expedition at a time when he could ill afford it. In the end, perhaps swayed by the fervour of the moment, or perhaps calculating that he could find excuses to delay his departure, Henry also took the cross. Richard's joy at his father's decision was palpable. Here, finally, was an adventure worthy of his talents, a cause that would allow him to step out of his father's shadow and achieve glory in his own right. He took the cross with an enthusiasm that impressed even the cynical nobles of the court, and immediately began making plans for the expedition. The practical challenges were enormous. A crusading army needed not just weapons and armour, but also ships for transportation, supplies for the journey, and enormous sums of money to fund the expedition. Henry II implemented the Saladin tithe, a revolutionary tax that required all of his subjects to contribute 1/10 of their income to the crusading effort. This was the first general income tax in English history, and its implementation required a massive bureaucratic effort. Richard threw himself into the preparations with characteristic intensity. He travelled throughout his domains, raising money and recruiting followers. His natural charisma served him well in this effort. Knights who might have hesitated to follow other leaders eagerly took the cross when Richard himself asked them to join the Holy War. The troubadours and poets who frequented Richard's court seized upon the crusading theme with enthusiasm. They composed songs that compared Richard to the great heroes of the past, to Roland defending the pass at Roncevaux, to Arthur seeking the Holy Grail, to Godfrey of Bouillon conquering Jerusalem in the First Crusade. These songs spread throughout Europe, carrying Richard's reputation far beyond the borders of his own domains and establishing him as one of the great heroes of the age even before he had set foot in the Holy Land. As 1188 turned to 1189, the crusading preparations continued at fever pitch. All across Europe, smiths worked day and night forging weapons and armour, shipbuilders constructed vessels for the journey, and farmers struggled to produce the grain and preserved meat that would feed the armies on their march. The entire continent seemed to be mobilizing for what promised to be the greatest military expedition since the days of the Roman Empire. But beneath the surface of this inspiring unity, the familiar patterns of medieval politics continued to operate. Henry II and Philip Augustus might have taken the cross together, but they remained enemies, each suspicious of the other's motives and concerned about the security of their domains during their absence. Richard, caught between his loyalty to his father and his own ambitions, found himself in an increasingly uncomfortable position. The crisis came in the summer of 1189. Henry II, perhaps having second thoughts about the wisdom of the crusading venture, began to delay his departure and seek excuses to postpone the expedition. Richard, his patience exhausted and his crusading fervour undimmed, made a decision that would shock the medieval world. He abandoned his father and allied himself with Philip Augustus, using the threat of French invasion to force Henry II to acknowledge him as heir to all the Plantagenet domains. The confrontation between father and son was brief but decisive. Henry II, defeated and broken-hearted, died at Chinon on July 6, 1189, just 2 days after being forced to accept Richard's demands. Legend claimed that the old king's corpse bled from the nose when Richard approached to pay his respects, a supernatural sign of the father's feelings toward the son who had betrayed him. Richard's grief at his father's death was genuine, but it was tempered by the knowledge that he was now free to pursue his crusading dreams without restraint. He was crowned King of England on September 3rd, 1189, in Westminster Abbey, but the ceremony was merely a formality. His thoughts were already fixed on the Holy Land, on the great adventure that would define his reign and his reputation. The new king's first actions set the tone for everything that would follow. Rather than consolidating his inheritance or strengthening his administration, Richard immediately began converting everything he owned into cash for the crusade. He sold official positions, granted charters for money, and even offered to sell London itself if he could find a buyer. The famous jest that he would have sold the Tower of London if anyone had been willing to pay for it captured the single-minded intensity with which he approached the crusading venture. As the summer of 1189 faded into autumn, Richard's preparations entered their final phase. Ships were being loaded with supplies in the ports of England and Normandy. Knights were saying farewell to their families, and the great adventure was about to begin. The young king, who had dreamed of crusading glory since childhood, was finally ready to test himself against destiny, to seek the reputation that would make him immortal in the songs of future generations. In castle halls across Europe, minstrels sang of the coming expedition, painting word pictures of the great battles that lay ahead, of the clash between Christian knight and Muslim warrior under the burning sun of Palestine. They sang of Richard Plantagenet, the Lionheart, the king who would restore Jerusalem to Christendom and win glory that would echo through the ages. But none of them, in their most inspired moments, could have imagined the reality of what lay ahead, the triumphs and disasters, the moments of brilliant victory and crushing defeat that would transform a crusading king into a legend whose story would be told around hearthfires for 1,000 years to come. The Mediterranean Sea stretched out before Richard's fleet like a vast blue pathway to destiny, its waters sparkling under the spring sun of 1191 as the crusading armada made its way eastward toward the Holy Land. The king's ship rode majestically among the hundreds of vessels that carried the hopes and dreams of Christian Europe, their sails billowing with the favorable winds that seemed to promise divine blessing on the great enterprise. Richard had spent nearly 2 years preparing for this moment. After his coronation in September 1189, he had thrown himself into the business of organizing what would become one of the most formidable military expeditions in medieval history. Every detail had been planned with the meticulous care that characterized all of Richard's military undertakings, from the quality of the weapons and armor to the preservation of food for the long journey, from the hiring of ships to the recruitment of the skilled artisans who would be needed to maintain siege engines in the field. The fleet that now sailed toward the east represented the culmination of those efforts. There were great cargo ships laden with supplies, sleek galleys carrying knights and their precious war horses, and smaller vessels packed with the crossbowmen and infantry who would form the backbone of the crusading army. Flying from the masts were the banners of a dozen kingdoms and duchies, their colourful heraldry creating a rainbow of medieval splendour against the blue Mediterranean sky. But the voyage had not begun without drama. Richard's meeting with Philip Augustus in Sicily had been marked by political tension and personal animosity. The two kings, despite their shared commitment to the crusading cause, remained rivals for dominance in Western Europe. Their armies camped separately around Messina, and the atmosphere was often more like that of hostile neighbours than allied crusaders. The situation had been complicated by Richard's decision to break his long-standing betrothal to Philip's sister Alice. This betrothal, arranged years earlier as part of a political alliance, had become increasingly problematic as Richard matured and developed his own ideas about marriage and diplomacy. Rumours had circulated for years about Alice's relationship with Richard's father Henry II, and whether true or not, these stories made the marriage politically impossible. Instead, Richard had chosen to marry Berengaria of Navarre, the daughter of King Sancho VI of Navarre. This choice was both romantic and strategic. Berengaria was renowned for her beauty and intelligence, while her father's kingdom controlled crucial mountain passes between France and Spain that could prove valuable in Richard's ongoing struggles with Philip Augustus. The wedding preparations had added another layer of complexity to the crusading expedition. Berengaria, accompanied by Richard's sister Joan, had travelled from Navarre to join the crusading fleet, bringing with her a retinue of Navarrese nobles and a treasure chest of wedding gifts and dowry money. Their ship was one of the most magnificent in the fleet, decorated with silken banners and carrying musicians who entertained the passengers with songs of courtly love and chivalric romance. As the fleet sailed eastward from Sicily, the Mediterranean revealed both its beauty and its dangers. On calm days, the sea was like a vast mirror reflecting the cloudless sky, while dolphins played in the bow waves of the ships and seabirds wheeled overhead. The nights were magical, with the fleet spread out across the waters like a constellation of floating stars, their lanterns twinkling in the darkness, while the sound of voices singing hymns and battle songs drifted across the waves. But the Mediterranean could also be treacherous, and in April 1191, as the fleet approached the coast of Cyprus, nature demonstrated its power with devastating effect. A violent storm arose almost without warning, transforming the peaceful sea into a churning cauldron of wind and waves that scattered the carefully organized fleet like leaves in an autumn gale. Richard, aboard his flagship, fought to maintain control as the storm raged around him. The great ship, despite its size and the skill of its crew, was tossed about like a child's toy by waves that rose higher than castle walls. All around him, other vessels struggled against the tempest, their crews working desperately to keep their ships afloat, while passengers prayed for deliverance. When dawn broke after that terrible night, the storm had passed, but its damage was immediately apparent. Ships were scattered across hundreds of miles of coastline, many of them driven ashore on the beaches of Cyprus. Most tragically, the vessel carrying Berengaria and Joan had been wrecked on the southern coast of the island, though fortunately, both women had survived the disaster. Cyprus, in 1191, was ruled by Isaac Comnenus, a Byzantine prince who had established himself as an independent ruler when the central authority of Constantinople had weakened in recent decades. Isaac was a complex figure, cultured and intelligent, but also paranoid and increasingly tyrannical in his rule over the Greek and Armenian inhabitants of the island. When news reached Isaac that crusading ships had been wrecked on his shores, his response revealed both the cupidity and the poor judgment that would prove his downfall. Rather than offering assistance to fellow Christians, he ordered his troops to seize the shipwrecked treasure and to hold the survivors as prisoners. This included not only common soldiers and sailors, but also high-ranking nobles and, most crucially, the women who would soon be Richard's bride and sister-in-law. Richard's reaction to this news was swift and volcanic. The king, who had shown such patience in organizing his crusade, such diplomatic skill in managing the complex politics of the expedition, now revealed the fierce warrior temperament that had earned him his epithet. The seizure of his bride and sister was not merely a political offence. It was a personal insult that demanded immediate and overwhelming response. The confrontation between Richard and Isaac Comnenus would become one of the most dramatic episodes of the entire crusading expedition. When Richard's ship arrived off the coast of Cyprus on May 1st, 1191, the stage was set for a conflict that would demonstrate all of the Lionheart's military genius and provide him with a strategic base that would prove invaluable throughout the rest of his eastern adventures. Isaac's first mistake was to underestimate his opponent. The Byzantine ruler had grown accustomed to dealing with the weak and divided forces that characterized much of the eastern Mediterranean, and he apparently believed that a single shipwrecked king could pose no serious threat to his island domain. When Richard sent messengers demanding the immediate release of the prisoners and the return of the seized treasure, Isaac's response was arrogant and dismissive. This proved to be a fatal miscalculation. Richard had at his disposal not just his own ship and its crew, but also many of the vessels from his scattered fleet that had managed to regroup after the storm. More importantly, he commanded some of the finest warriors in Europe, knights who had been training for this crusade for years and who were eager to prove themselves in battle. The landing at Limassol was a masterpiece of medieval amphibious warfare. Richard's ships approached the beach in formation, their hulls cutting through the azure waters, while crossbowmen provided covering fire from the decks. As the vessels ground against the sandy shore, knights leaped into the surf, their mail armor glinting in the sunlight as they waded toward the beach with swords drawn and battle cries echoing across the water. Isaac had positioned his forces along the shoreline, confident that he could repel any landing attempt. But he had reckoned without Richard's tactical brilliance and the superior training of the crusading army. The king personally led the assault, splashing through the waves with his sword held high, his distinctive red-gold hair streaming behind him like a battle banner. The sight of Richard charging ashore had an electrifying effect on his followers. Knights who had been looking forward to proving themselves in the Holy Land found themselves instead fighting for their king on a beautiful Mediterranean island, and they responded with enthusiasm that was almost religious in its intensity. The beach was soon littered with the bodies of Isaac's soldiers, while the survivors fled inland in panic. But this was only the beginning of Richard's Cypriot adventure. Isaac, despite his initial defeat, still controlled most of the island and had significant military resources at his disposal. He retreated to his fortresses in the interior, apparently hoping to conduct a defensive campaign that would eventually force the Crusaders to abandon their conquest and continue their journey to the Holy Land. This strategy might have worked against a different opponent, but Isaac had chosen to fight against one of the finest military minds of the medieval period. Richard understood immediately that half measures would not suffice. If he was going to conquer Cyprus at all, he would need to do so completely and quickly, before word of his delay reached other crusading leaders or potential enemies in the Holy Land. The campaign that followed was a brilliant demonstration of medieval warfare at its most sophisticated. Richard divided his forces into multiple columns, each tasked with conquering a different section of the island, while preventing Isaac from concentrating his remaining troops for an effective counterattack. The king himself led the main force along the coast, systematically reducing Isaac's coastal fortresses while maintaining contact with his fleet for supplies and reinforcement. The speed of the conquest was breathtaking. Within days, Richard's forces had captured town after town, castle after castle, as Isaac's demoralized troops offered increasingly feeble resistance. The local population, long oppressed by Isaac's increasingly harsh rule, often welcomed the Crusaders as liberators, providing intelligence about enemy positions and supplies for the advancing army. Meanwhile, the wedding between Richard and Berengaria proceeded amidst this backdrop of military conquest. The ceremony, held in the chapel of Limassol on May 12, 1191, was one of the most romantic episodes in an age that idealized courtly love and chivalric romance. Here was a warrior king, fresh from victory in battle, marrying his chosen bride in a chapel decorated with the banners of a dozen nations, while outside the Mediterranean sun shone down on an island that was being conquered in her honor. The wedding feast was a magnificent affair, with tables groaning under the weight of local delicacies, fresh fish from the Mediterranean, fruits from the island's orchards, wine from vineyards that had been producing since ancient times. Musicians played while dancers performed, and poets recited verses celebrating the union of the greatest warrior of the age with one of the most beautiful women in Europe. But even in the midst of celebration, Richard's mind remained focused on the military situation. Isaac Comnenus, despite his defeats, had not yet surrendered, and the king knew that the conquest would not be complete until the Byzantine ruler was either captured or eliminated as a threat. The final confrontation came at the fortress of Kantara, perched on a mountain peak in the eastern part of the island. Isaac had retreated there with the remnants of his army, apparently hoping that the strength of the position would allow him to hold out until Richard grew tired of the siege and departed for the Holy Land. But Richard had no intention of leaving Cyprus unconquered. The strategic value of the island was too great. It provided a perfect base for operations in the eastern Mediterranean, a secure supply depot for the crusading army, and a source of revenue that could help fund the expensive business of holy war. The siege of Kantara became a contest of wills between two very different types of ruler. Isaac represented the old Byzantine tradition of defensive warfare, relying on strong fortifications and the hope that enemies would eventually grow weary and depart. Richard embodied the aggressive Western European approach to warfare, believing that decisive action and overwhelming force could solve any military problem. The outcome was never really in doubt. Richard's siege engines, operated by skilled engineers who had been recruited specifically for the Crusade, systematically reduced the fortress's defenses while his crossbowmen picked off defenders on the walls. More importantly, the king's reputation for both military brilliance and personal courage in battle had a devastating effect on enemy morale. Stories spread through Isaac's remaining forces of Richard's superhuman strength, of his ability to cut down multiple opponents in single combat, of the almost supernatural aura of victory that seemed to surround him. When the end came, it came suddenly. Isaac, perhaps recognizing the futility of further resistance, or perhaps simply overwhelmed by the psychological pressure of facing the legendary Lionheart, suddenly abandoned his fortress and attempted to flee the island by ship. But Richard's naval forces were waiting, and the former emperor of Cyprus was captured as he tried to escape to the mainland. The meeting between Richard and Isaac Comnenus was one of those moments that medieval chroniclers loved to describe in detail. Here was the contrast between old and new, between the declining Byzantine tradition and the rising power of Western European knighthood. Isaac, once proud and arrogant, now stood before Richard in chains, though the king, with characteristic attention to the niceties of rank, had ordered that the chains be made of silver rather than iron, in recognition of Isaac's imperial blood. Richard's treatment of his defeated enemy revealed both the chivalric ideals that guided his actions and the practical political calculations that informed his decisions. Isaac was not executed, as might have been expected, but was instead kept as an honored prisoner. This clemency served multiple purposes. It demonstrated Richard's magnanimity to potential allies and enemies alike, while also preserving Isaac as a potential diplomatic asset for future negotiations with Byzantium. The conquest of Cyprus was complete by June 1st, just 1 month after Richard had first landed on the island. The speed and thoroughness of the victory sent shockwaves throughout the eastern Mediterranean world. Here was clear proof that the new crusade would be different from its predecessors, that it was led by commanders of exceptional ability who would not be deterred by the kind of obstacles that had defeated earlier expeditions. For Richard personally, the Cyprus campaign was a moment of pure triumph. He had demonstrated his military genius on a stage visible to all of Europe and the Middle East. He had acquired a bride whose beauty and intelligence made her a worthy consort for a legendary king, and he had gained control of an island whose strategic and economic value would serve his interests for years to come. The wealth of Cyprus was particularly important for the cash-strapped crusading expedition. The island's fertile fields produced grain and other foodstuffs that could supply Richard's army, while its strategic position allowed him to control shipping routes throughout the eastern Mediterranean. Most immediately valuable were the treasures that Isaac had accumulated during his years of independent rule, gold and silver that could be used to hire additional troops and purchase supplies for the continuation of the crusade. But perhaps most importantly, the Cyprus campaign had given Richard's followers their first taste of victory in the east. The knights and soldiers who had endured the hardships of the long journey from Western Europe now had proof that their sacrifices would be rewarded, that their king possessed not just the reputation, but also the actual ability to win battles against Eastern opponents. The impact on morale was tremendous. Around the campfires at night, soldiers told and retold the stories of the campaign, how Richard had personally led the charge onto the beach at Limassol, how he had outmaneuvered Isaac's forces in battle after battle, how he had shown both courage in combat and wisdom in strategy. These stories, embellished and romanticized with each telling, began to create the legend that would eventually make Richard one of the most famous warriors in human history. The integration of Cyprus into Richard's crusading strategy also demonstrated his remarkable ability to adapt his plans to changing circumstances. The original intention had been to sail directly to the Holy Land and immediately join the siege of Acre, which had been ongoing for nearly 2 years. But when the storm scattered his fleet and created the opportunity to conquer Cyprus, Richard had the strategic vision to recognize that this unexpected development could actually strengthen his position for the campaigns to come. The administrative arrangements Richard made for Cyprus revealed another aspect of his character, his understanding that military conquest was only the beginning of effective rule. He appointed Richard de Camville and Robert of Thornham as governors, choosing men who combined military experience with administrative competence. He established a legal system that balanced the need to maintain order with respect for local customs and traditions, and he began the process of integrating Cyprus into the broader economic and political networks of the crusading states. The final ceremony before leaving Cyprus was the coronation of Berengaria as Queen of England, a magnificent affair held in the Cathedral of Limassol with all the pageantry that medieval royalty could muster. The new queen, radiant in silk and jewels, received the homage of the assembled nobles, while Richard, resplendent in his royal regalia, looked on with evident pride and satisfaction. But even as he celebrated these personal and political triumphs, Richard's thoughts were already turning toward the greater challenges that awaited him in the Holy Land. Reports from the siege of Acre spoke of desperate fighting, of Christian armies that had been struggling for months against Saladin's forces without achieving decisive victory. The time had come to test his abilities against the greatest Muslim commander of the age, to discover whether the reputation he had won in the West and enhanced in Cyprus would serve him in the ultimate theatre of medieval warfare. As Richard's fleet prepared to depart Cyprus in early June 1191, the king stood on the deck of his flagship, looking back at the island that had provided him with his first eastern victory. The setting sun painted the mountains of Cyprus in shades of gold and purple, while the lights of Limassol twinkled like stars in the gathering dusk. It was a moment of peaceful beauty that contrasted sharply with the violence and chaos that had marked the conquest, a reminder that even in an age of constant warfare, there were moments of transcendence that lifted the human spirit above the mere business of killing and conquest. The musicians on the ship struck up a melody that had become popular among the crusading forces, a haunting air that spoke of distant homes and noble causes, of loves left behind and glories yet to be won. As the fleet sailed eastward through the night, carrying Richard toward his destiny at Acre and his legendary confrontation with Saladin, the music drifted across the dark waters like a prayer or a promise, the sound of medieval dreams made manifest in the warm Mediterranean night. The ancient port city of Acre rose from the Mediterranean coastline like a medieval fortress born from the dreams of military architects, its massive walls and towers casting long shadows across the harbour where hundreds of ships from across the known world lay at anchor. As Richard's fleet approached the besieged city on that fateful morning of June 8, 1191, the king stood at the prow of his flagship, his keen eyes taking in every detail of what would become the most important battlefield of his crusading career. The sight that greeted Richard was unlike anything in his previous military experience. For nearly 2 years, Christian and Muslim armies had been locked in a deadly embrace around Acre's walls, creating a double siege that defied conventional military logic. Inside the city, Saladin's garrison held firm against the Christian besiegers, while outside the walls, Saladin's main army had surrounded the Christian camp, creating a situation where besiegers had themselves become besieged. The Christian camp sprawled across the hills and plains around, Acre like a temporary city of canvas and timber, home to perhaps 100,000 souls from every corner of Christendom. Here were knights from France and England, Germany and Italy, Hungary and Poland, their colourful banners creating a rainbow of medieval heraldry against the brown earth of Palestine. Here were foot soldiers and crossbowmen, engineers and artisans, clergy and camp followers, all united in the common cause of holy war. But the camp also bore the marks of the terrible suffering that had characterized the siege. Disease had ravaged the Christian forces with ruthless efficiency, carrying off both great nobles and common soldiers with equal indifference. The cemetery outside the camp was a vast field of graves marked by simple wooden crosses that spoke eloquently of the price that had already been paid for this great enterprise. Richard's arrival transformed the entire character of the siege. The king, who had conquered Cyprus in a month, brought with him not just fresh troops and supplies, but also the intangible but crucial quality of hope. Here was a commander whose reputation for military genius preceded him, whose personal courage in battle was already legendary, and whose strategic vision had already been proven in campaigns from Aquitaine to the eastern Mediterranean. The first challenge Richard faced was diplomatic rather than military. King Philip Augustus of France had arrived at Acre several weeks earlier, and the relationship between the two monarchs remained as complex and tension-filled as it had been during their earlier meetings in Sicily. Both men were strong-willed rulers accustomed to commanding absolute obedience, and their rivalry for leadership of the crusading expedition created undercurrents of conflict that threatened to undermine the entire enterprise. Philip had already established himself in a strong position within the Christian camp, forging alliances with various noble factions and beginning the construction of siege engines that would be needed for the final assault on Acre's walls. His followers argued that his earlier arrival gave him precedence in the leadership of the siege, while Richard's supporters countered that the English king's greater military reputation and larger army made him the natural commander of the expedition. The tension between the two kings was exacerbated by their different approaches to warfare. Philip was a methodical commander who preferred careful planning and systematic approaches to military problems. Richard, while equally capable of strategic thinking, was more inclined toward bold strokes and decisive action that could transform the entire character of a campaign. But both kings recognized that their personal rivalries had to be subordinated to the greater goal of capturing Acre. The city was the key to the entire crusading enterprise. Its harbour would provide a secure base for Christian operations in the Holy Land, while its capture would deal a devastating blow to Saladin's prestige and military position. The siege engines that Philip had begun constructing were marvels of medieval military engineering. Great trebuchets, their massive wooden frames towering above the Christian camp like mechanical giants, could hurl stone projectiles weighing hundreds of pounds against Acre's walls with devastating effect. Mangonels and catapults of various sizes provided a continuous bombardment that made life within the city a constant nightmare of falling stones and splintering timber. Richard's arrival brought additional engineering expertise to bear on the problem of reducing Acre's fortifications. The king had recruited some of the finest military engineers in Europe for his crusade, men who understood not just the construction of siege engines, but also the complex art of undermining fortified walls. Under their direction, Christian forces began digging tunnels beneath Acre's walls, planning to collapse entire sections of the fortification through carefully placed fires and excavations. The defenders of Acre, meanwhile, fought back with equal determination and considerably more desperation. They knew that surrender would likely mean death or slavery, and they had been sustained throughout the long siege by the hope that Saladin's main army would eventually break the Christian blockade and relieve the city. Every day brought new attempts to communicate with the outside world, using carrier pigeons, swimmers willing to risk their lives crossing the harbour at night, and other ingenious methods. Saladin himself remained a constant presence just outside the Christian camp, his army always visible on the hills surrounding Acre, like a constant reminder of the precarious nature of the crusading position. The great Muslim commander understood as well as anyone that Acre's fall would represent a strategic disaster of the first magnitude, and he continued to probe for weaknesses in the Christian defences while planning more ambitious relief efforts. The daily rhythm of the siege was punctuated by sudden bursts of violent action that could erupt at any moment. Christian assault parties would attempt to scale Acre's walls under cover of darkness, only to be met by defenders who poured boiling oil and Greek fire down upon them. Muslim sortie parties would burst from the city gates in desperate attempts to destroy siege engines or capture prisoners, leading to fierce hand-to-hand combat in the narrow spaces between the walls and the Christian earthworks. Richard threw himself into this deadly routine with characteristic intensity. Unlike many medieval kings who preferred to direct battles from safe positions behind their armies, the Lionheart could be found wherever the fighting was fiercest. Contemporary chroniclers described him walking the siege lines at all hours of the day and night, encouraging his soldiers, inspecting defensive positions, and personally participating in the most dangerous operations. The king's personal courage became legendary even among his enemies. On one occasion, when illness had confined him to his bed, Richard had himself carried to the siege lines on a litter so that he could continue directing operations while recovering from fever. From this improvised command post, he used a crossbow to pick off defenders on Acre's walls, demonstrating the deadly accuracy that had made him famous in tournaments and battles across Europe. This incident became one of the most celebrated episodes of the entire siege, inspiring countless retellings in the years and centuries that followed. Here was a king so devoted to the cause of holy war that not even serious illness could keep him from the battlefield, a ruler who shared the dangers and hardships of his humblest followers. The image of Richard shooting from his sickbed while wrapped in silk coverlets became a powerful symbol of crusading dedication. The psychological warfare surrounding the siege was as important as the physical combat. Both sides understood that morale would ultimately determine the outcome of the siege, and they employed every possible means to undermine their enemies' will to fight. Christian priests held services in full view of the city walls, their prayers and hymns carrying across the intervening space to remind the defenders of their isolation from the broader Muslim world. Muslim defenders, in turn, displayed captured Christian banners and weapons from the walls, silent testimony to their continued resistance. The arrival of summer brought new challenges to both besiegers and besieged. The heat of a Palestinian summer was devastating to Europeans unaccustomed to such extreme temperatures, and disease spread even more rapidly through the overcrowded Christian camp. The problem of supplying fresh water to tens of thousands of soldiers and camp followers became a daily crisis that required constant attention from the crusading leadership. Richard's administrative genius became evident in his handling of these logistical challenges. Drawing on his experience governing the diverse populations of his European domains, he established systems for distributing supplies, maintaining sanitation, and caring for the sick and wounded that were remarkably sophisticated for their time. His ability to keep a large army functioning under extremely difficult conditions was no less important to the success of the siege than his tactical brilliance on the battlefield. The beginning of July brought signs that the siege was finally approaching its climax. The constant bombardment from Christian siege engines had opened several breaches in Acre's walls, while the undermining operations had weakened the foundations of entire sections of the fortification. Inside the city, the garrison was running short of food and fresh water, and morale was beginning to crack under the strain of the prolonged siege. Saladin made one final desperate attempt to relieve the city, launching a coordinated attack against the Christian camp while the garrison attempted a breakout from within. The battle that followed was one of the most confused and desperate of the entire siege, with fighting erupting simultaneously at dozens of different points as both sides committed their reserves in what everyone understood might be the decisive engagement. Richard's leadership during this critical battle demonstrated all the qualities that had made him one of the greatest military commanders of his age. He seemed to be everywhere at once, appearing wherever the fighting was fiercest, rallying troops who were beginning to waver, and personally leading counterattacks that drove back Muslim assault parties. His red-gold hair streaming behind him like a battle banner, his sword cutting through enemy ranks with deadly efficiency, Richard became the embodiment of crusading valor for his followers. The failure of Saladin's relief attempt marked the beginning of the end for Acre's defenders. Cut off from outside assistance and facing the prospect of final assault by the Christian army, the garrison began to consider surrender. Secret negotiations began through intermediaries, as both sides attempted to find terms that would end the siege without unnecessary bloodshed. On July 12, 1191, after nearly 2 years of siege and countless thousands of casualties, the banners of England, France, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem were finally raised over Acre's walls. The great city, key to the eastern Mediterranean and symbol of Christian-Muslim rivalry in the Holy Land, had fallen to the crusading army. The moment of victory was both triumphant and sobering. Richard and Philip, their rivalries temporarily set aside, entered the conquered city together in a ceremony designed to demonstrate the unity of Christian purpose. But even in the moment of triumph, the seeds of future conflict were already apparent in the competing claims of different national contingents and the complex negotiations surrounding the treatment of the Muslim garrison. The terms of Acre's surrender called for the payment of a massive ransom, the return of Christian prisoners held by Saladin, and the restoration of the true cross that had been captured at Hattin. These negotiations would continue for weeks, creating a tense standoff that would ultimately lead to one of the most controversial episodes of Richard's entire crusading career. But for now, in the immediate aftermath of victory, the Christian camp erupted in celebration. Te Deum was sung in the Cathedral of Acre. Thanksgiving services were held throughout the crusading army, and messengers were dispatched to carry news of the victory to every corner of Christendom. The first major objective of the Third Crusade had been achieved, and the road to Jerusalem seemed finally to be open. As the summer sun set over the ancient stones of Acre on that night of July 12th, 1191, Richard stood on the walls of the conquered city, looking out over the Mediterranean toward the distant shores of Europe. Behind him, the crusading camp was alive with celebration, while before him lay the greater challenges of the campaign to come. The siege was over, but the legend of Richard the Lionheart was just beginning. The coastal road from Acre to Jaffa stretched southward like a ribbon of golden sand between the azure Mediterranean Sea and the sun-baked hills of Palestine, a pathway that had witnessed the passage of armies since the dawn of recorded history. As August gave way to September in the year 1191, this ancient route would become the stage for one of the most celebrated military achievements of the medieval period, Richard the Lionheart's masterful march to victory at the Battle of Arsuf. The crusading army that assembled outside Acre's walls in late August was a magnificent sight to behold. After the conquest of the city, Richard had spent weeks reorganizing and resupplying his forces, integrating the various national contingents into a unified command structure that could function effectively in the challenging conditions of Palestinian warfare. The result was perhaps the finest Christian army that had ever operated in the Holy Land, disciplined, well-equipped, and inspired by their recent victory. Philip Augustus had departed for France shortly after Acre's fall, claiming illness, but more likely motivated by political concerns about the security of his kingdom during his absence. His departure left Richard as the undisputed leader of the crusading expedition, a position he had long desired, but which also brought the full weight of responsibility for the success or failure of the entire enterprise. The strategic situation facing Richard was both promising and perilous. Acre's capture had provided the Crusaders with a secure base of operations and had dealt a significant blow to Saladin's prestige, but the great Muslim commander remained at large with a formidable army at his disposal. The ultimate goal of the Crusade, the recapture of Jerusalem, still lay many miles to the south, and the route to the Holy City was controlled by hostile forces under the leadership of one of the greatest military minds of the age. Richard's decision to advance southward along the coast, rather than striking directly inland toward Jerusalem, demonstrated the strategic thinking that made him such a formidable opponent. The coastal route offered several crucial advantages. It kept the crusading army in contact with the Christian fleet that could provide supplies and reinforcement. It avoided the waterless interior where Saladin's cavalry would have every advantage, and it allowed for the systematic reduction of Muslim-held ports that could threaten Christian supply lines. The organization of the march revealed Richard's genius for military logistics. The crusading army moved in a carefully orchestrated formation that maximized its defensive capabilities while maintaining the flexibility needed for rapid response to enemy attacks. The core of the formation consisted of 12 mounted regiments, each containing roughly 100 knights, the heavy cavalry that formed the backbone of medieval military power. But Richard understood that knights alone, however skillful and brave, could not survive against the mobile tactics favored by Muslim armies. He therefore arranged his forces so that the precious heavy cavalry was protected by multiple layers of infantry, with crossbowmen forming the outer screen to provide covering fire against enemy horse archers. The baggage train moved between the sea and the main body of the army, protected from direct attack, while remaining accessible for supply purposes. The pace of the march was deliberately measured, designed to preserve the strength of both men and horses under the brutal Palestinian sun. Richard had learned from the disaster at Hattin that haste could be fatal in the desert climate, and he insisted on frequent rest stops, always near sources of fresh water. The army moved only in the early morning and evening hours, avoiding the devastating heat of midday that could prostrate even the hardiest warriors. Saladin, meanwhile, had been using the week since Acre's fall to reorganize his own forces and develop a strategy for stopping the Christian advance. The great Muslim commander understood that he could not afford to allow Richard to reach Jerusalem unmolested, but he also recognized the danger of engaging the crusading army in direct battle while it remained in good order and high morale. The strategy Saladin adopted was one of harassment and attrition, designed to wear down the Christian forces through constant pressure without committing to a decisive engagement until conditions were favorable for Muslim victory. His army shadowed the crusading march like a pack of wolves following a caravan, striking at vulnerable points and then melting away before the Christians could mount an effective response. The daily routine of the march became a test of endurance and discipline that pushed both armies to their limits. Each morning, as the first light of dawn painted the eastern hills with rose and gold, the crusading army would rouse itself from the brief respite of sleep and prepare for another day of arduous travel under hostile observation. Knights would don their heavy mail armor despite the heat, knowing that a surprise attack could come at any moment. Horses would be saddled and supplied with the precious water that meant the difference between life and death in the Palestinian climate. As the army began its daily movement, the harassment would begin almost immediately. Muslim horse archers would appear as if from nowhere, galloping close enough to loose their arrows before wheeling away faster than the heavily armored Christian cavalry could pursue. The sound of their horns and war cries echoed across the landscape like the voices of demons, while clouds of dust marked their passage across the sun-baked earth. The Christian response to these attacks required iron discipline and unwavering trust in their commanders. The natural instinct of any knight was to charge at enemies who dared to attack him. But Richard had made it clear that unauthorized pursuits would not be tolerated. The army must maintain its formation regardless of provocation, moving steadily southward, while the crossbowmen provided what protection they could against the swarms of enemy archers. For the foot soldiers who bore the brunt of the harassment, the march became an ordeal that tested human endurance to its limits. They walked backward for hours at a time, maintaining formation while facing the enemy and presenting their shields against the constant rain of arrows. Many of these brave men continued to march with multiple arrow shafts protruding from their leather and mail armor, the barbed points unable to penetrate deeply enough to cause serious wounds, but serving as constant reminders of their vulnerability. The psychological pressure was as intense as the physical hardship. The crusading army was advancing through hostile territory, surrounded by enemies who knew every hill and valley, every water source and defensible position. The knowledge that Saladin's main army was always nearby, ready to attack at any sign of weakness or disorder, created a tension that affected every member of the expedition, from the greatest noble to the humblest camp follower. Richard's leadership during this trying period demonstrated all the qualities that had made him legendary even before his arrival in the Holy Land. He seemed to be everywhere at once, riding up and down the column to check on his troops, appearing at critical moments when enemy pressure was heaviest, and maintaining the morale of his army through the sheer force of his personality. The sight of the king, magnificent in his royal surcoat and gleaming mail, his red gold hair visible beneath his helm, became a rallying point for crusading valor. The Muslim chronicler Baha al-Din, who witnessed many of these encounters, left vivid descriptions of the Christian army's discipline under extreme provocation. He wrote with admiration of soldiers who continued to march despite having 10 or more arrows embedded in their armor, of crossbowmen who maintained their formation while under constant attack, and of the remarkable self-control displayed by knights who yearned to charge but held their positions on their king's command. As the army approached the forest of Arsuf, Saladin realized that his strategy of harassment was not producing the desired results. The Christian army remained intact and in good order, its morale apparently unbroken, despite days of constant pressure. The time had come for more decisive action, and the wooded terrain around Arsuf offered the best opportunity for the kind of surprise attack that might shatter Christian discipline and open the way for total victory. The forest of Arsuf was a rarity in the generally arid landscape of Palestine, a stretch of woodland that extended for more than 12 miles along the coast, providing cover for large bodies of troops and opportunities for ambush that did not exist in the open country. Saladin positioned his forces carefully within this natural fortress, preparing for the most important battle of his career. September 7th, 1191, dawned clear and hot, with the kind of brilliant sunshine that made metal armor almost unbearable and turned the act of breathing into conscious effort. As the crusading army emerged from their overnight encampment, the soldiers could sense that this day would be different from those that had preceded it. The usual scattered bands of harassing cavalry were nowhere to be seen, and an ominous silence hung over the landscape like the calm before a thunderstorm. Richard, with the intuition of a master strategist, recognized the signs of impending battle. He took personal charge of the army's disposition, ensuring that each unit knew its role in the fighting to come, and that the complex signals that would coordinate their movements were understood by every commander. The formation that had served them so well during the march was adapted for the requirements of pitched battle, with the heavy cavalry held in reserve, while the infantry prepared to bear the initial shock of enemy attack. The Battle of Arsuf began with a sound that participants would remember for the rest of their lives, the thunderous crash of Saladin's entire army bursting from the concealment of the forest like a tide of steel and horsehair. Thousands of mounted warriors, their banners streaming in the wind and their war cries echoing across the plain, descended upon the Christian army in what was intended to be an overwhelming assault that would decide the fate of the Holy Land. The sight was both terrifying and magnificent. The flower of Muslim chivalry in full attack, their colorful robes and polished weapons glinting in the morning sun as they rode toward what they hoped would be the final destruction of the crusading expedition. At their head rode Saladin himself, the great commander whose name had become synonymous with Muslim resistance to Christian invasion, leading his men toward what he believed would be his greatest victory. But Richard had prepared his army well for this moment. The Christian formation held despite the shock of impact, the infantry maintaining their lines, while the crossbowmen poured a deadly rain of bolts into the advancing Muslim ranks. The discipline that had been forged during the long march now paid dividends as each unit fought with grim determination, while maintaining coordination with their neighbors. The battle raged for hours under the blazing Palestinian sun, with neither side able to gain decisive advantage. Saladin's forces attacked again and again, their superior numbers and mobility giving them opportunities to find weak points in the Christian line. But each time they seemed on the verge of breakthrough. Richard's tactical genius and the superior armor and training of his troops allowed the Crusaders to maintain their position. As the morning wore on, the pressure on the Christian rearguard became almost unbearable. The Knights Hospitaller, who held this crucial position, found themselves fighting for their very survival against repeated attacks by the elite troops of Saladin's army. Their Grand Master, Garnier de Nablus, repeatedly requested permission to launch a counterattack, but Richard held firm to his strategy of waiting for the perfect moment to unleash his heavy cavalry. The climax came when the strain finally became too much for human endurance to bear. Whether through breakdown of discipline or through a calculated decision by their commanders, the Hospitallers suddenly burst from the Christian line in a desperate charge that carried them deep into the Muslim ranks. The sight of the black crosses on white surcoats cutting through enemy formations galvanized the entire crusading army. Richard, recognizing that the moment of crisis had arrived, made the decision that would determine the outcome of the battle and, potentially, the entire crusade. Rather than attempting to recall the Hospitallers or limiting the engagement to a single unit, he ordered the general advance that committed his entire army to the attack. The signal was given, 6 clear blasts on the trumpets that could be heard even above the din of battle. What followed was one of the most devastating cavalry charges in medieval military history. The flower of European knighthood, held in check for hours of desperate fighting, was finally unleashed in a coordinated assault that smashed through Saladin's ranks like a thunderbolt. The sight of hundreds of heavily armored knights charging at full gallop, their lances leveled and their war cries echoing across the battlefield, was enough to break the morale of even the most determined enemy. Saladin's army, which had seemed on the verge of victory just moments before, suddenly found itself in full retreat. The careful tactical formations dissolved into chaos as individual units sought to escape the devastation of the Christian charge. The great Muslim commander himself barely escaped capture, his bodyguard fighting desperately to cover his withdrawal as the tide of battle turned completely against him. But Richard's genius was evident not just in his timing of the charge, but also in his ability to control it once it had begun. Medieval cavalry charges had a tendency to dissolve into individual pursuits that left the attackers vulnerable to counterattack, but the Lionheart managed to maintain enough control over his forces to halt the advance and regroup for renewed action when Saladin attempted to rally his troops. The victory at Arsuf was complete and overwhelming. Saladin's reputation for invincibility had been shattered, while Richard's prestige as a military commander reached new heights. The road to Jaffa now lay open, and with it the possibility of further advances toward the ultimate goal of Jerusalem. The Battle of Arsuf had not only demonstrated Richard's tactical brilliance, but had also provided the crusading movement with its greatest victory since the capture of Jerusalem in the First Crusade. As the sun set over the battlefield on September 7th, 1191, the crusading army counted its victory, while caring for its wounded and preparing to continue the advance. Richard, exhausted but triumphant, looked out over the field where his reputation had been confirmed and his enemies scattered. The legend of the Lionheart had reached its full flowering, and the name of Richard of England would be remembered as long as men told tales of courage and glory in battle. The golden walls of Jerusalem shimmered in the distance like a mirage of divine promise, visible from the heights of Nebi Samuel on that cold January morning in 1192, when Richard's army came within 12 miles of Christianity's holiest city. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. The greatest warrior of his age gazed upon the objective that had driven him across continents and through years of preparation and sacrifice. Then, in a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life, he ordered the retreat that would ensure Jerusalem remained beyond his grasp. The months following the victory at Arsuf had seen Richard's reputation reach heights that seemed almost superhuman to contemporary observers. The systematic conquest of the Palestinian coast proceeded with the methodical efficiency that marked all of the Lionheart's military operations. Jaffa fell to the Crusaders on September 10th, just 3 days after the Great Battle, its defenders fleeing before an army whose confidence had been transformed by their recent triumph. But Richard understood that military victories, however spectacular, were meaningless unless they served larger strategic objectives. The conquest of the coastal cities was not an end in itself, but rather a necessary prerequisite for the ultimate goal that drove every Christian warrior in the Holy Land: the liberation of Jerusalem from Muslim control and the restoration of Christian rule over the city where Christ himself had walked. The challenges facing any attempt to recapture Jerusalem were formidable and multifaceted. The city itself was strongly fortified and garrisoned by troops loyal to Saladin, who understood that the loss of Jerusalem would represent not just a strategic defeat, but a catastrophic blow to Muslim morale throughout the region. More importantly, Jerusalem lay in the interior of Palestine, far from the coastal bases that allowed Richard to maintain contact with his fleet and receive the constant flow of supplies that his army required. The strategic dilemma was one that had faced military commanders since ancient times: whether to attempt a direct assault on the primary objective, or to continue the methodical reduction of enemy strongholds that would eventually make the main target untenable. Richard's methodical nature inclined him toward the latter approach, but he was also aware that time was working against the crusading expedition. News from Europe brought constant reminders that Richard's prolonged absence from his kingdom was creating opportunities for his enemies to advance their own interests. Philip Augustus had returned to France and was already beginning to probe the defences of Richard's continental possessions, while Prince John, Richard's younger brother, was showing signs of the ambition that would eventually make him one of history's most notorious kings. The diplomatic situation was equally complex. Saladin, despite his defeat at Arsuf, remained a formidable opponent with substantial military resources at his disposal. But the great Muslim commander was also facing his own political pressures, with rival claimants to power within the Ayyubid dynasty and the constant challenge of maintaining unity among the diverse ethnic and religious groups that made up his army. It was in this context that one of the most fascinating episodes of the entire crusade began to unfold: the series of diplomatic exchanges between Richard and Saladin that would continue throughout the remainder of the campaign. These negotiations, conducted through intermediaries and marked by a mixture of genuine mutual respect and calculated political maneuvering, revealed both leaders as sophisticated statesmen as well as brilliant military commanders. The first contacts came in the weeks following Arsuf, when both armies were exhausted from the intensity of the campaign and seeking opportunities to rest and regroup. Saladin, recognizing that he could not defeat Richard in direct military confrontation, began to explore the possibility of achieving through diplomacy what had proven impossible through force of arms. The Muslim proposals were remarkable for their sophistication and their recognition of the realities facing both sides. Saladin offered to negotiate a division of Palestine that would leave the coastal cities in Christian hands while maintaining Muslim control over Jerusalem and the interior. Such an arrangement would have given the crusading states secure access to the sea while preserving Muslim control over their most sacred sites. But for Richard, such proposals represented an unacceptable compromise with the fundamental objectives of the crusade. He had not travelled thousands of miles and spent the better part of his royal treasury to negotiate away the prize that had motivated the entire expedition. Jerusalem was not simply another city to be bartered in diplomatic negotiations. It was the symbol of everything the crusading movement represented, the goal that justified every sacrifice and validated every hardship endured during the long journey to the east. The winter months of 1191 to 1192 were spent in a complex dance of military preparation and diplomatic maneuvering that demonstrated the sophisticated political calculations underlying medieval warfare. Both armies used the respite from active campaigning to strengthen their positions and explore various strategic options, while their leaders engaged in the kind of psychological warfare that often proved as effective as physical combat. Richard established his winter headquarters at Jaffa, transforming the conquered city into a forward base for operations against Jerusalem. The king threw himself into the work of fortification with the same intensity he had shown in actual combat, personally supervising the construction of new walls and towers that would protect the Christian enclave against future Muslim attacks. The sight of the legendary Lionheart working alongside common labourers, his royal hands dirty with mortar and stone dust, became one of the most celebrated images of the entire crusade. The systematic strengthening of Jaffa's defences was more than just military necessity. It was also a powerful statement of Christian determination to maintain their foothold in the Holy Land regardless of immediate setbacks. The massive stones that were quarried from nearby hills and fitted into place by skilled masons would stand for centuries as monuments to Richard's vision of permanent Christian presence in Palestine. But even as he supervised these defensive preparations, Richard's thoughts remained fixed on the ultimate objective. Throughout the winter months, his scouts ranged far inland, mapping routes to Jerusalem and gathering intelligence about Muslim dispositions. The king himself made several reconnaissance expeditions toward the Holy City, coming close enough to observe its walls and defences while remaining hidden from enemy patrols. These personal observations confirmed what Richard had suspected from the beginning, that any assault on Jerusalem would require careful preparation and overwhelming force. The city's natural defences were formidable, perched on hills that made direct assault extremely difficult, while Saladin had used the months since Hattin to strengthen the man-made fortifications that protected the approaches to the Holy City. More troubling was the intelligence regarding Muslim morale within Jerusalem itself. Unlike many of the coastal cities that had fallen to the Crusaders, Jerusalem was defended by troops who understood that they were fighting for the very heart of their civilization. The loss of the Holy City would represent a catastrophe that might shatter Muslim unity throughout the region, and Saladin's commanders were prepared to fight with the desperation of men defending their most sacred possessions. The arrival of spring in 1192 brought new urgency to Richard's deliberations. The campaigning season was beginning, and decisions could no longer be postponed. The King's War Council, meeting in the great hall of Jaffa's restored palace, was divided between those who favored an immediate assault on Jerusalem and those who counseled continued operations along the coast to secure the crusading army's supply lines. The debate revealed the fundamental tension that had characterized the entire crusading movement between the religious enthusiasm that demanded immediate action against the Holy City and the military pragmatism that recognized the enormous risks involved in such an undertaking. Richard found himself torn between his own desire for the glory that would come with Jerusalem's liberation and his responsibility as a commander to preserve the lives of his followers. The decision to advance toward Jerusalem, when it finally came in May 1192, represented a compromise between these competing pressures. Richard would lead his army inland toward the Holy City, but he would also maintain flexibility to withdraw if conditions proved unfavorable for a successful siege. This cautious approach reflected the hard-earned wisdom of a commander who had learned to balance boldness with prudence. The march from Jaffa toward Jerusalem was unlike any of Richard's previous campaigns in the Holy Land, where the coastal advance had been characterized by constant harassment from Muslim forces. The inland route was marked by an eerie silence that seemed more threatening than open combat. Saladin had withdrawn his main forces to concentrate them around Jerusalem, leaving the countryside empty except for the occasional scout or messenger who disappeared like shadows when Christian patrols approached. The landscape itself seemed to reflect the spiritual significance of the journey. The rolling hills of central Palestine, covered with olive groves and vineyards that had been cultivated since biblical times, provided a dramatically different setting from the coastal plains where Richard had won his greatest victories. Here were the terraced slopes where ancient prophets had walked, the stone villages where Christian pilgrims had sought shelter for centuries, the holy places that gave meaning to the entire crusading enterprise. As the army climbed toward the heights around Jerusalem, the weather began to deteriorate in ways that seemed almost supernatural to men already sensitized to signs of divine approval or disapproval. The spring rains, which should have ended weeks earlier, continued with unprecedented intensity, turning the roads into rivers of mud and making the movement of siege equipment almost impossible. The cold was particularly devastating to an army that had spent months adapting to the heat of the Palestinian summer. Knights accustomed to sweltering in their armor now found themselves shivering uncontrollably as icy rain penetrated every gap in their defenses. Horses died by the hundreds, their carcasses lining the route of advance like markers of the army's suffering. But it was the sight of Jerusalem itself, when the army finally reached the heights of Nebi Samuel on January 3rd, 1192, that provided the most profound test of Richard's leadership and resolve. There, spread out in the valley below, lay the objective that had motivated every sacrifice and justified every hardship of the long journey from Europe. The golden stones of the holy city seemed to glow with inner light even under the grey winter sky, while the dome of the former Temple Mount caught what little sunlight penetrated the clouds. The emotional impact on the crusading army was overwhelming. Hardened warriors wept openly at their first sight of the city, where Christ had been crucified and resurrected, while priests led prayers of thanksgiving for having been permitted to come so close to Christianity's most sacred places. For a moment, the practical considerations of siege warfare seemed secondary to the sheer wonder of being within reach of their ultimate goal. But Richard's strategic mind remained focused on the military realities that would determine the success or failure of any siege. From his vantage point on the heights, he could see the strength of Jerusalem's defenses and the disciplined activity of Saladin's forces within the city walls. More importantly, he could assess the logistical challenges that would face any besieging army in this remote location, far from the supply lines that had sustained previous operations. The council of war that convened that evening in Richard's tent was one of the most momentous in the history of the crusading movement. The greatest military commanders of the age debated the fundamental question that would determine the fate of Christian presence in the Holy Land, whether to attempt the siege that might liberate Jerusalem or to withdraw to positions that could be more easily defended. The arguments on both sides were compelling. Those who favored the siege pointed to the enormous symbolic importance of Jerusalem and the devastating blow that its capture would deal to Muslim morale throughout the region. They argued that the army was as strong as it would ever be, that the weather would improve with the coming of spring, and that the opportunity to achieve the ultimate goal of the crusade might never come again. The opponents of the siege, led by some of Richard's most experienced commanders, painted a sobering picture of the military realities involved. Jerusalem's defences were formidable and would require months of siege warfare to reduce. The army's supply lines would be vulnerable to constant attack by Muslim forces, while the approach of spring would bring the threat of disease that had devastated previous crusading expeditions. Most crucially, even if Jerusalem could be captured, holding it against the inevitable Muslim counterattacks would require resources that the crusading army simply did not possess. Richard listened to these arguments with the careful attention that characterized all his strategic deliberations. The king, who had shown such boldness in battle, now demonstrated equal wisdom in recognizing the limits of what military force could achieve. After hours of debate that stretched deep into the night, he made the decision that would define his historical legacy as much as any victory on the battlefield. The withdrawal from the heights of Jerusalem began at dawn on January 4th, 1192, in a silence that seemed to echo with the weight of abandoned dreams. The crusading army that had come within 12 miles of its ultimate objective now turned away from the holy city, beginning the long march back toward the coast and the more limited goals that military necessity had imposed upon them. The psychological impact of this retreat was devastating for many in the crusading army. Soldiers who had endured years of hardship and sacrifice now felt that their efforts had been wasted, that they had been denied the glory and spiritual rewards that had motivated their participation in the Holy War. Some blamed Richard's caution for the failure to achieve the ultimate objective, while others questioned whether divine favor had been withdrawn from the crusading cause. But Richard himself understood that strategic retreat could sometimes represent greater wisdom than tactical victory. The decision to withdraw from Jerusalem preserved the crusading army as an effective fighting force and maintained Christian control over the territorial gains that had been achieved during the campaign. More importantly, it demonstrated the kind of disciplined leadership that distinguished truly great commanders from those who allowed emotion to override military judgment. The second advance toward Jerusalem, launched in June 1192 after months of regrouping and resupply, followed a similar pattern of initial success, followed by strategic withdrawal. This time, the army advanced even closer to the Holy City, coming within sight of its walls before the same combination of logistical challenges and Muslim resistance forced another retreat to the coast. By the autumn of 1192, both Richard and Saladin were exhausted by 3 years of intensive campaigning and ready to explore the diplomatic solutions that military action had failed to provide. The negotiations that led to the Treaty of Jaffa represented a mature recognition by both leaders that their respective strategic objectives could best be achieved through compromise rather than continued warfare. The terms of the treaty, signed on September 2nd, 1192, reflected the military stalemate that had developed over the course of the campaign. Christians would retain control of the coastal cities from Tyre to Jaffa, providing them with secure access to the sea and a defensible base for future operations. Muslims would maintain control of Jerusalem and the interior, preserving their hold on the sites most sacred to their faith. Perhaps most importantly from Richard's perspective, the treaty guaranteed safe passage for Christian pilgrims to visit Jerusalem, allowing the spiritual objectives of the Crusade to be partially fulfilled, even though the political goals had proven unattainable. European Christians would once again be able to pray at the Holy Sepulchre and walk the Via Dolorosa, the path tradition claimed Christ had followed to his crucifixion. The final irony of Richard's Jerusalem campaigns was that the king himself never entered the holy city that had been the ultimate objective of his crusading efforts. Despite having negotiated pilgrimage rights for his followers, Richard declined to make the journey himself, explaining that he could not, in good conscience, visit as a pilgrim what he had failed to liberate as a conqueror. This decision, perhaps more than any military victory or diplomatic triumph, revealed the complex character of the man who had become known as the Lionheart. Here was a king who understood that true leadership sometimes required accepting personal disappointment in service of larger objectives, who could subordinate his own desires to the strategic necessities that would preserve Christian presence in the Holy Land for future generations. As Richard prepared for his departure from the Holy Land in October 1192, he could look back on 3 years of campaigning that had transformed the military and political landscape of the Eastern Mediterranean. The crusading states, nearly destroyed by Saladin's victories in the 1180s, had been restored to viability through a combination of military brilliance and diplomatic skill. The Muslim world, while retaining control of Jerusalem, had been forced to acknowledge that Christian presence in the region could not be eliminated through military action alone. The legend of Richard the Lionheart had been forged in the heat of these campaigns, creating a reputation that would outlive empires and inspire stories for 1,000 years. But perhaps the most important legacy of the Jerusalem campaigns was the demonstration that even the greatest warriors must sometimes accept the limits of what can be achieved through force of arms, and that true wisdom lies in knowing when to fight and when to negotiate. The autumn winds of 1192 carried with them the bittersweet scent of endings as Richard stood on the harbour quay of Acre for the last time, watching his ships being loaded with the remnants of 3 years of crusading dreams. Behind him lay the Holy Land that had consumed his thoughts and energies since youth, where he had won immortal glory but failed to achieve his ultimate goal. Ahead lay the treacherous journey home through a Europe where his enemies had grown strong during his absence and his friends had become uncertain allies. The decision to depart the Holy Land was perhaps the most difficult of Richard's entire life. Every instinct of the warrior king cried out against leaving Jerusalem in Muslim hands, against abandoning the cause that had brought him such fame and cost him such treasure. But the cold realities of medieval politics demanded his return to England, where his brother John's machinations threatened the very foundations of Plantagenet power. The intelligence reports that reached Richard throughout the summer of 1192 painted an increasingly desperate picture of affairs in his western domains. Philip Augustus, freed from his crusading vows and returned to France, had wasted no time in exploiting Richard's absence to advance French territorial claims. Norman castles were under siege, Angevin's strongholds were being systematically reduced, and the carefully constructed defensive network that protected Richard's continental inheritance was crumbling under sustained French assault. Even more alarming were the reports concerning Prince John's activities in England itself. Richard's younger brother, left as regent during the king's absence, had begun to behave more like an independent ruler than a temporary guardian of royal authority. John had dismissed Richard's appointed administrators, replaced them with his own supporters, and was systematically undermining the loyalty of the English nobility through a combination of bribes, threats, and promises of future favour. The news that forced Richard's final decision came in early September, when reliable sources reported that John had begun negotiating with Philip Augustus for recognition as the rightful King of England. The implications were staggering. If John could secure French support for his usurpation, Richard might return from his crusading triumph to find himself a king without a kingdom. The preparations for departure revealed the complex logistics involved in extracting a royal army from a distant theatre of operations. Ships had to be hired for the return journey. Treasure had to be gathered and secured, and arrangements had to be made for the soldiers and followers who would remain in the Holy Land to continue the work of defending the Christian settlements. Richard's personal preparations were equally complex. The king, who had arrived in the East as a young ruler eager for glory, was now departing as a mature commander whose reputation had been established beyond question. The 3 years of campaigning had transformed not just his military standing, but also his understanding of the complex political realities that governed medieval rulership. The departure ceremony at Acre was a magnificent and melancholy affair that captured the contradictory emotions surrounding Richard's crusading legacy. Representatives from every Christian community in the Holy Land gathered to bid farewell to the king who had restored their fortunes and secured their future, at least temporarily, against Muslim reconquest. Bishops offered prayers for the safe return of the crusading hero, while knights who had served under Richard's banner wept openly at the prospect of losing their legendary commander. But beneath the pageantry lay the recognition that Richard's departure marked the end of an era in the history of the crusading movement. Never again would the Christian states of the East enjoy the protection of such a formidable military leader. Never again would they benefit from the presence of a king whose very name could rally warriors from across Europe to their defense. The ship that carried Richard away from Acre on October 9th, 1192, was a far different vessel from the magnificent flagship that had brought him east 3 years earlier. Where the earlier journey had been marked by royal splendor and triumphant ceremony, the return voyage was characterized by the practical necessities of speed and stealth. Richard traveled with only a small retinue of his most trusted followers, having left the main body of his army to continue the defense of the crusading states under the leadership of his appointed lieutenants. The choice of route for the return journey would prove to be one of the most fateful decisions of Richard's entire life. The obvious path lay through the western Mediterranean and around the coast of Spain to the familiar ports of Aquitaine, where Richard could expect a friendly reception and secure passage to his continental domains. But this route would add weeks to the journey, and every day of delay increased the danger that John's conspiracy might succeed in permanently alienating English support from the rightful king. Richard chose instead to attempt the shorter but far more dangerous route through the Adriatic Sea and across the territories of the Holy Roman Empire. This path would bring him through lands controlled by enemies who had their own reasons for wishing to see the Lionheart's career come to an abrupt end. But it offered the possibility of reaching England weeks earlier than the safer western route would allow. The first sign of trouble came when violent storms forced Richard's ship to seek shelter at Corfu, an island controlled by the Byzantine Empire under Isaac II Angelus. The Byzantine emperor had his own grievances against Richard, primarily stemming from the English king's conquest of Cyprus, which Isaac considered to be rightfully part of the Byzantine sphere of influence. Recognizing the danger of his position, Richard attempted to disguise his identity and continue his journey in secret. The great king, who had commanded the respect and fear of rulers across 2 continents, now found himself reduced to traveling in the humble garb of a merchant, his famous red-gold hair hidden beneath a common hood, and his magnificent presence diminished by the necessity of avoiding recognition. But Richard's attempts at concealment were doomed to failure. His very bearing marked him as a man of noble birth, while his inability to speak the local languages fluently created suspicions that eventually led to his identification. More fatally, his companions included several knights whose loyalty to their king overcame their understanding of the need for secrecy, and whose behavior inevitably drew attention to their small party. The disaster came near Vienna, in the territories controlled by Leopold V, Duke of Austria. Leopold was one of the most dangerous enemies Richard could have encountered, a man whose personal grievances against the English king were reinforced by political calculations that made Richard's capture an irresistible opportunity. The roots of Leopold's hatred lay in events that had occurred during the siege of Acre, when Richard had ordered the Austrian banner torn down from the walls of the conquered city and thrown into the moat below. This insult to Austrian honour had been compounded by Richard's obvious disdain for Leopold's pretensions to equal status with the kings of England and France, and by various slights and dismissals that had accumulated over the course of the crusading campaign. But Leopold's motives went beyond personal revenge. The Duke of Austria was a vassal of the Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI, and he understood that the capture of Richard the Lionheart would provide his overlord with unprecedented leverage in the complex political calculations that governed European diplomacy. An imprisoned English king represented potential gains that far exceeded any ransom that might be demanded for his release. Richard's capture near Vienna in December 1192 marked the beginning of what would become one of the most celebrated episodes in medieval literature and legend. The transformation of the crusading hero into a prisoner of his enemies created a dramatic reversal of fortune that captured the medieval imagination and inspired countless stories, songs, and romantic tales. The reality of Richard's captivity was far less romantic than the legends that would later surround it. The king was initially held at Dürnstein Castle, a forbidding fortress perched on a rocky promontory overlooking the Danube River. The castle's massive walls and isolated position made escape virtually impossible, while its location in the heart of Leopold's territory ensured that any rescue attempt would face overwhelming obstacles. The conditions of Richard's imprisonment reflected the complex diplomatic calculations surrounding his capture. He was not treated as a common criminal or enemy prisoner, but rather as a captive of royal rank, whose detention required careful attention to the niceties of medieval protocol. The Lionheart was provided with quarters appropriate to his status, allowed to maintain a small retinue of servants, and permitted to receive visitors and correspondence under careful supervision. But despite these courtesies, Richard remained a prisoner whose fate depended entirely on the political calculations of his captors. Leopold's initial demands included not just an enormous financial ransom, but also political concessions that would have fundamentally altered the balance of power in Western Europe. The English king was to acknowledge the Holy Roman Emperor as his overlord, to provide military assistance for imperial campaigns in Italy, and to surrender various territorial claims that conflicted with German interests. Meanwhile, the news of Richard's capture sent shockwaves throughout the courts of Europe. In England, Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine, now in her 70s, but still a formidable political force, immediately began organizing efforts to secure her son's release. The Queen who had survived 2 royal marriages, participated in a crusade, raised rebellious sons, and governed kingdoms in her own right, now faced perhaps the greatest challenge of her remarkable life. Eleanor's campaign to free Richard demonstrated the sophisticated diplomatic and financial networks that characterized high medieval politics. She dispatched envoys to every major court in Europe, seeking allies who might pressure Leopold and Henry VI to release their captive. She negotiated with the Pope, whose moral authority provided the only potential check on imperial ambitions. And most crucially, she began the enormous task of raising the ransom that would ultimately be demanded for Richard's freedom. The sum, eventually specified 150,000 marks of silver, was staggering by medieval standards, equivalent to several years' worth of royal revenue from England alone. The collection of this treasure required extraordinary measures that touched every level of English society, from the greatest nobles to the humblest peasants. Churches were required to surrender their silver vessels, monasteries were taxed on their accumulated wealth, and every landowner in the kingdom was assessed according to his ability to contribute to the king's liberation. The political ramifications of Richard's captivity extended far beyond the immediate question of ransom. Prince John, recognizing an unprecedented opportunity to advance his own claims to the throne, began openly asserting his right to rule England during his brother's imprisonment. He allied himself with Philip Augustus, who was equally eager to exploit Richard's misfortune to advance French territorial ambitions at English expense. The months of captivity became a test of medieval political loyalty that revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of personal kingship. Some of Richard's subjects remained steadfastly devoted to their imprisoned king, convinced that his eventual return would restore the glory and prosperity that had characterized his reign. Others, more pragmatically inclined, began to hedge their bets by establishing connections with John and preparing for the possibility that Richard might never return to claim his throne. Throughout these trials, Richard himself displayed the same combination of courage and political skill that had marked his military career. Despite the restrictions of captivity, he maintained correspondence with supporters throughout his domains, coordinated resistance to John's usurpation attempts, and negotiated with his captors for terms that would secure his release without fundamentally compromising his royal authority. The legendary episodes that would later be associated with Richard's captivity, the stories of the faithful minstrel Blondel, searching castle by castle for his imprisoned master, the romantic tales of secret messages and daring rescue attempts, reflected the genuine drama of the situation and the widespread European fascination with the plight of the crusading hero. But the reality was more prosaic and ultimately more impressive than the romantic legends. Richard's release was secured not through dramatic rescue or miraculous intervention, but through the patient accumulation of political pressure and financial resources that eventually made his continued detention more costly to his captors than his freedom. The final negotiations for Richard's release revealed the complex web of European politics that had made his captivity possible in the first place. Henry VI, facing his own political challenges in Italy and Germany, eventually concluded that the diplomatic costs of holding Richard prisoner outweighed the potential benefits. The English king's release was negotiated as part of a broader settlement that included not just the payment of ransom, but also various political agreements that satisfied imperial concerns without fundamentally compromising Plantagenet independence. On February 4th, 1194, after more than a year in captivity, Richard finally regained his freedom at a ceremony in Mainz that was attended by representatives from across Europe. The sight of the Lionheart walking free from his imprisonment was a powerful symbol of royal resilience and a reminder that even the greatest reverses of fortune could be overcome through determination and the loyalty of faithful subjects. The Richard who emerged from captivity was a changed man, marked by the experience of powerlessness and dependency in ways that would influence the remainder of his reign. The king, who had once seemed invincible, had learned the bitter lesson that political fortune could be reversed in an instant, and that even legendary reputations provided no guarantee against the machinations of enemies and the uncertainties of medieval politics. The cathedral bells of London rang out across the February morning air in 1194, as word spread through the narrow streets that their king had returned from the dead. Richard the Lionheart, the crusading hero who had been missing for over a year, the sovereign whom many had given up for lost in some distant dungeon, was once again free and riding toward England with all the majesty that had made him the most famous warrior in Christendom. The news of Richard's liberation from captivity had travelled ahead of him like wildfire across the windswept channel, carried by merchants and pilgrims, nobles and clergy, who understood that they were witnessing one of the great reversals of fortune in medieval history. The king, who had been reduced to a prisoner in Austrian dungeons, was now returning to reclaim his throne and restore his authority over domains that had trembled on the brink of dissolution during his absence. But the England that awaited Richard's return was not the realm he had left behind 3 years earlier, when the crusading fever had called him eastward to Jerusalem. The kingdom had been scarred by conspiracy and rebellion, its treasury drained by the enormous ransom that had purchased the king's freedom, and its political stability shaken by the ambitious schemes of Prince John and his ally, Philip Augustus of France. Eleanor of Aquitaine, now past 70 but still formidable in her intelligence and determination, had worked tirelessly during Richard's captivity to preserve his inheritance against the predations of his enemies. The Queen Mother, who had survived 2 royal marriages and raised a dynasty of kings, had faced perhaps the greatest challenge of her remarkable life in maintaining Plantagenet power, while her most capable son languished in foreign prisons. The systematic campaign Eleanor had orchestrated to secure Richard's release had been a masterpiece of medieval diplomacy and financial organization. Every resource of the Plantagenet domains had been mobilized in service of the king's liberation. Churches had surrendered their treasures, nobles had mortgaged their estates, and common people had contributed what little they could spare to the great collection that would eventually total the staggering sum of 150,000 marks of silver. Richard's first act upon landing in England was to proceed immediately to Winchester, where the ancient regalia of English kingship awaited his return. The journey from the southern coast to the old Saxon capital became a triumphal procession that demonstrated the enduring power of royal charisma and the loyalty that the Lionheart could still inspire among his subjects. Villages turned out in their entirety to witness the passage of their legendary king, while church bells pealed across the countryside in celebration of his return. The man who rode through the English landscape bore the marks of his recent ordeal. His face was leaner, his manner more serious, and his famous red-gold hair now showed the first silver threads that spoke of the burdens he had borne. But his bearing remained regal, his presence still commanding, and his reputation as the greatest warrior of his age intact. The second coronation ceremony at Winchester Cathedral on March 17th, 1194, was designed to erase any question about the legitimacy of Richard's continuing rule and to reaffirm his authority over a kingdom that had been shaken by more than a year of uncertainty. The ancient ritual was performed with all the sacred pageantry that medieval Christianity could provide, while representatives of every level of English society gathered to witness their king's symbolic rebirth. The crown that was placed upon Richard's head in Winchester Cathedral was the same that had adorned the brows of his father Henry II and his illustrious predecessors, but the king who wore it was subtly different from the young monarch who had departed for the Holy Land with such confidence and ambition. The experience of captivity had taught Richard bitter lessons about the fragility of power and the constant vigilance required to maintain royal authority in an age of endemic political instability. But if captivity had sobered Richard, it had not broken his spirit or diminished his capacity for the kind of decisive action that had made him legendary. Within days of his coronation, the king was already planning the military campaigns that would be necessary to restore his continental domains and punish those who had taken advantage of his enforced absence. Prince John, recognizing that his brother's return had ended any hope of seizing the English throne, attempted to make peace through intermediaries and family connections. The reconciliation between the royal brothers, when it finally occurred, was a carefully orchestrated affair designed to demonstrate royal mercy while making clear the consequences of future disloyalty. Richard's treatment of John revealed both the political necessities that governed medieval kingship and the personal bonds that still connected the Plantagenet brothers despite their recent antagonism. The king chose to interpret John's rebellion as misguided ambition rather than treasonous conspiracy, granting his brother a formal pardon while also ensuring that future opportunities for mischief would be severely limited. But the greater challenge lay across the Channel, where Philip Augustus had spent Richard's captivity systematically reducing the defensive network that protected the Plantagenet continental inheritance. Norman castles had fallen to French siege engines. Angevin strongholds had been occupied by French garrisons, and the carefully constructed balance of power that Henry II had established was crumbling under sustained French pressure. The strategic situation that confronted Richard in the spring of 1194 was more desperate than any he had faced during his crusading campaigns. Where Saladin had been content to contain Christian expansion while maintaining Muslim control over the interior of Palestine, Philip Augustus was engaged in a systematic campaign of conquest designed to eliminate Plantagenet power from France entirely. Richard's response demonstrated the same combination of strategic vision and tactical brilliance that had made him legendary in the Holy Land. Rather than attempting to recapture his lost territories through expensive and time-consuming siege warfare, the king opted for a campaign of rapid movement and surprise attacks that would exploit French vulnerabilities while avoiding the kind of prolonged confrontations that favored his enemies. The Lionheart's return to continental warfare marked a new phase in his career, characterized by a more mature understanding of the political and military realities that governed European conflict. The king, who had once sought glory through spectacular victories, now focused on the methodical work of restoring his inheritance through whatever means proved most effective. The first major test of Richard's restored military capabilities came at the Siege of Nottingham, where supporters of Prince John had established themselves in apparent defiance of royal authority. The reduction of this stronghold provided Richard with an opportunity to demonstrate that his legendary military skills remained intact despite his recent trials. The Siege of Nottingham was a masterpiece of medieval military engineering that showcased all the innovations Richard had learned during his eastern campaigns. The king personally supervised the construction of siege engines, whose designs reflected the best practices he had observed during the long siege of Acre, while his tactical dispositions revealed the hard-earned wisdom of a commander who had faced the finest military minds of his age. But perhaps more importantly, Richard's conduct during the siege demonstrated his continuing ability to inspire loyalty and enthusiasm among his followers. The knights and soldiers who had served under other commanders during his captivity now rediscovered the unique charisma that had made the Lionheart such an effective leader of men. The surrender of Nottingham marked the effective end of John's rebellion and the restoration of undisputed royal authority throughout England. But Richard understood that his English kingdom, however secure, was merely the foundation for the greater struggle that awaited him in France. The real test of his political and military recovery would come in the complex campaigns necessary to restore Plantagenet power on the continent. The crossing to Normandy in May 1194 marked the beginning of what would become the final phase of Richard's career. 5 years of almost constant warfare against Philip Augustus that would showcase both the heights of medieval military art and the ultimate limitations of even the greatest individual commanders when faced with superior resources and strategic position. The Normandy that Richard found upon his return bore the scars of French occupation and the systematic destruction that had characterized Philip's campaigns during the king's absence. Ancient strongholds that had protected Plantagenet interests for generations lay in ruins, their walls breached by French siege engines and their garrisons scattered or captured. But Richard's arrival transformed the entire strategic situation almost overnight. The news that the Lionheart had returned spread through the Norman countryside like wildfire, inspiring hope among supporters who had despaired of ever seeing their rightful duke again, and striking fear into the hearts of French commanders who remembered their previous encounters with Richard's military genius. The campaign that followed was one of the most remarkable in medieval military history, a systematic restoration of Plantagenet power through a combination of military brilliance, diplomatic skill, and the sheer force of Richard's legendary reputation. Castle after castle returned to Plantagenet control, sometimes through siege warfare, but more often through negotiation with commanders who preferred to surrender to the Lionheart rather than face the consequences of defying him. The psychological impact of Richard's return proved to be as valuable as any military victory. The king, whose capture had seemed to signal the end of Plantagenet power, was now demonstrating that legends could become reality, that individual excellence could triumph over seemingly impossible odds, and that the greatest warriors could indeed rise from apparent defeat to achieve new heights of glory. As autumn approached in 1194, Richard could look back on a year that had seen one of the most dramatic reversals of fortune in medieval history. The prisoner who had languished in Austrian dungeons was now once again master of his domains. The captive king had become the architect of military campaigns that were restoring the balance of power in Western Europe. But even as he celebrated these triumphs, Richard understood that his greatest challenges lay ahead. Philip Augustus remained a formidable enemy with substantial resources at his disposal, while the costs of ransoming the king and financing his restoration campaigns had drained the Plantagenet treasury to levels that threatened the long-term sustainability of the dynasty's military ambitions. The Richard who ended 1194 as master of his restored domains was a more complex figure than the young king who had departed for the Crusade with such confidence and ambition. He remained the greatest warrior of his age, the commander whose tactical genius and personal courage could inspire men to achieve impossible victories. But he was also now a monarch who had learned the bitter lessons of political vulnerability and understood that even legendary reputations provided no guarantee against the machinations of determined enemies. The stage was set for the final act of Richard's extraordinary career, the years of warfare and diplomacy that would determine whether the Plantagenet Empire could survive the sustained assault of its enemies, and whether the Lionheart's personal legend would be sufficient to overcome the structural challenges that threatened his dynasty's future. The spring of 1199 found Richard the Lionheart in the 41st year of his life, still the most feared warrior in Christendom, but bearing the accumulated weight of decades spent in almost constant warfare. The king, who had once seemed blessed with supernatural luck and invincible in battle, was now engaged in what would prove to be his final campaign, a siege that began over a treasure and ended with the death of a legend. The castle of Châlus-Chabrol stood on a rocky promontory in the Limousin region of southwestern France, an unremarkable fortress that under normal circumstances would never have attracted the attention of a king whose name was known from the halls of Byzantium to the courts of Scotland. But these were not normal circumstances, and the events that had brought Richard to the walls of this modest stronghold were emblematic of the complex web of feudal politics that governed medieval life. The story began, as so many medieval tales did, with the discovery that seemed touched by providence or cursed by fate, depending on one's perspective. A peasant working in the fields near Châlus had unearthed what appeared to be a cache of Roman-era treasures, golden figures and precious objects that spoke of wealth beyond the dreams of common folk. Word of the discovery had reached Aymar V, Viscount of Limoges, who claimed the treasure as his feudal right. But Richard, as Duke of Aquitaine and overlord of the region, maintained that any treasure found within his domains belonged to him by right of sovereignty. The dispute might have been resolved through negotiation or legal proceedings, but the Viscount chose instead to defy his overlord's claim, setting in motion the chain of events that would ultimately cost Richard his life. The decision to besiege Châlus-Chabrol revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of Richard's character in the final phase of his career. On one hand, his refusal to allow any challenge to his authority, no matter how minor, demonstrated the uncompromising nature that had made him such an effective ruler. On the other hand, his willingness to risk his person in what was essentially a minor punitive expedition showed a recklessness that seemed to increase with age rather than diminish. The siege itself was notable primarily for its insignificance. Châlus-Chabrol was defended by perhaps 40 men-at-arms, a garrison so small that the outcome was never in doubt. The castle's walls, while strong enough to resist casual assault, were no match for the siege engines that Richard's engineers could deploy, and the defenders lacked both the supplies and the reinforcements that might have prolonged their resistance. Yet Richard approached this minor operation with the same meticulous attention to detail that had characterized his greatest campaigns. The king personally supervised the placement of siege engines, inspected the defensive preparations of his own forces, and maintained the kind of active presence on the battlefield that had become his trademark throughout a lifetime of warfare. It was this very attention to the details of siege warfare that would prove to be Richard's undoing. On the evening of March 25th, 1199, the king was conducting his customary inspection of the siege works, moving along the lines with the casual confidence of a commander who had survived countless similar situations. The day had been a success. His mangonels had opened a breach in the castle's outer wall, and surrender seemed imminent. The defenders of Châlus-Chabrol, recognizing that their situation was hopeless, had largely abandoned serious resistance in favor of making token gestures of defiance before the inevitable surrender. One young crossbowman, perhaps seeking to distinguish himself in the final moments of the siege, had positioned himself on the castle walls with the kind of crude shield improvised from a cooking pot that spoke eloquently of the garrison's desperate circumstances. Richard, amused by the young man's makeshift armor and impressed by his courage in the face of certain defeat, had actually applauded the defenders' efforts acknowledging the kind of gallant futility that appealed to his chivalric sensibilities. It was a moment of good-humoured recognition between warriors, the sort of romantic gesture that troubadours loved to celebrate in their songs of noble combat. But medieval warfare, for all its chivalric pretensions, remained a deadly serious business where momentary lapses in caution could have fatal consequences. As Richard observed the young crossbowman's defiant display, his attention was focused more on the spectacle than on his own protection. The king, who had survived battles against the finest warriors of his age, who had faced Saladin's best commanders and emerged victorious, was momentarily vulnerable in a way that would have been inconceivable during his prime. The crossbow bolt that struck Richard in the shoulder was not particularly well aimed or unusually powerful. Under normal circumstances, such a wound would have been painful but not life-threatening, easily treated by the skilled physicians who travelled with royal armies. But the bolt had struck at an unfortunate angle, penetrating deep into the king's shoulder and lodging in a position that made removal extremely difficult. The initial reaction to the king's wounding was more one of embarrassment than alarm. Richard himself seemed more annoyed by the interruption to his siege operations than concerned about his injury, and he initially attempted to remove the bolt himself rather than wait for medical assistance. This decision, motivated by the same impatience that had driven him throughout his career, would prove to be fatally misguided. The amateur surgery that Richard performed on himself in the dim light of his pavilion only worsened the wound, driving the bolt deeper and creating the kind of tissue damage that medieval medicine was poorly equipped to address. By the time skilled physicians were summoned to examine the king, the wound had already begun to show signs of the infection that would ultimately claim his life. The medical treatment that followed reflected both the limitations of medieval healing arts and the genuine efforts of learned men to save their royal patient. The court physicians employed every technique known to their era: herbal poultices to draw out infection, prayers and relics to invoke divine assistance, and careful attention to the king's diet and environment to promote healing. But 12th century medicine, for all its theoretical sophistication, lacked the understanding of bacteria and antiseptic procedures that might have saved Richard's life. The wound that should have healed within weeks instead festered and spread. The infection, creeping through the king's body with the relentless progression that marked the onset of what medieval doctors called the sacred fire, gangrene. As Richard's condition deteriorated, word of the king's mortal illness spread throughout the Plantagenet domains and beyond. The news that the Lionheart lay dying from a wound received in an insignificant siege sent shockwaves through the political establishments of Europe, where rulers and nobles began to calculate the implications of his potential death for their own interests and ambitions. The deathbed scene at Charlus, as later chroniclers would describe it, became one of the most celebrated episodes in the Richard legend. Despite his pain and the growing certainty of his approaching death, the king maintained the dignity and courage that had marked his entire career. He summoned his most trusted advisors to arrange for the succession, disposed of his personal effects with characteristic generosity, and prepared to meet his end with the same calm determination he had shown in facing the greatest challenges of his life. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Richard's final days was his treatment of the young crossbowman, whose bolt had delivered the fatal wound. When the castle finally surrendered and the defenders were brought before the dying king, Richard ordered that the youth be spared and even rewarded for his courage. This act of magnanimity, performed while the king was dying from the very wound the young man had inflicted, became one of the most celebrated examples of chivalric grace in medieval literature. The conversation between Richard and his slayer, as recorded by chroniclers, revealed both the king's understanding of the warrior's code that had governed his life and his acceptance of the role that fate and fortune played in determining the destinies of even the greatest heroes. There was no anger or desire for revenge, only a kind of philosophical acceptance that death in battle was the natural end for a man who had lived by the sword. On April 6, 1199, as the spring sun set over the hills of Limousin, Richard the Lionheart drew his last breath in the arms of his mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, who had rushed to his bedside upon hearing news of his mortal wound. The Queen, who had outlived 2 royal husbands and buried several of her children, now faced the loss of the son, who had been her greatest pride and most brilliant achievement. The death of Richard sent immediate shockwaves throughout the medieval world. In the crusading states of the East, where his memory was still revered as that of the greatest Christian warrior of the age, special masses were said for the repose of his soul. In the courts of Europe, where his reputation had made him both feared and respected, rulers began to recalculate the balance of power that his death would inevitably disturb. Philip Augustus of France, Richard's longtime rival and enemy, received the news with the complex mixture of satisfaction and regret that marked the end of a worthy opponent. The French king had spent decades fighting against Richard's military genius and political acumen, and while he welcomed the removal of such a formidable adversary, he also recognized that he had lost the opponent who had most tested his own capabilities and driven him to achieve his greatest victories. The immediate question facing the Plantagenet domains was that of succession, an issue complicated by Richard's lack of legitimate heirs and the competing claims of various family members. The king's death, without direct descendants, opened the way for the succession disputes that would ultimately lead to the loss of most of the Plantagenet continental inheritance and the rise of the Capetian dynasty as the dominant power in Western Europe. John Lackland, Richard's youngest brother, moved quickly to assert his claim to both the English throne and the continental domains, but his succession was immediately challenged by Arthur of Brittany, the son of Richard's deceased brother Geoffrey. The ensuing conflict would consume the Plantagenet inheritance in civil war and provide Philip Augustus with the opportunities he needed to complete the conquest of Normandy and Anjou. The division of Richard's body for burial reflected both medieval religious practices and the political realities of his scattered domains. His heart was interred at Rouen Cathedral in Normandy, the duchy that had been the foundation of Plantagenet power. His entrails were buried at Charlus itself, where he had received his mortal wound. The remainder of his body was entombed at Fontevraud Abbey in Anjou, beside the graves of his father Henry II and, eventually, his mother Eleanor. The legend of Richard the Lionheart began to take shape even before his body was cold. The story of his death, struck down in an insignificant siege by a chance shot from an amateur warrior, seemed to capture something essential about the relationship between heroic ambition and human mortality that resonated deeply with medieval audiences. The chroniclers who recorded Richard's life and death for posterity painted him as the embodiment of the chivalric ideal, brave to the point of recklessness, generous to both friends and enemies, and dedicated to the causes of holy war and knightly honor, above all considerations of personal safety or political advantage. This image, while not entirely accurate, captured something true about Richard's character and helped to establish his reputation as one of the great romantic heroes of medieval literature. But perhaps the most fitting epitaph for Richard the Lionheart was provided by his enemies rather than his friends. Saladin, upon hearing news of the Christian king's death, was reported to have said that the world had lost its greatest warrior and that neither Christian nor Muslim would see his like again. This tribute from the man who had been Richard's greatest opponent and most worthy adversary spoke more eloquently than any formal eulogy to the extraordinary impact that the Lionheart had made on his age. The castle of Chaillot-Chabrol, where Richard met his end, became a pilgrimage site for those who wished to honour the memory of the crusading king. The modest fortress that had seemed so insignificant during the siege was transformed by Richard's death into a monument to the fragility of human greatness and the unpredictable nature of historical destiny. As news of Richard's death spread throughout Christendom, carried by merchants and pilgrims, minstrels and monks, the legend that would outlive empires and inspire literature for 1,000 years began to take shape. The king, who had dreamed of liberating Jerusalem and had instead found glory in battles from Cyprus to Normandy, had achieved a different kind of immortality, not through the conquest of cities or the accumulation of territories, but through the creation of a reputation that would echo through the ages. The violent end of Richard the Lionheart at Chaillot-Chabrol on that April evening in 1299 marked the close of one of the most extraordinary careers in medieval history. The boy who had rebelled against his father to claim his inheritance, the young man who had answered the call to crusade with such enthusiasm, the warrior who had faced Saladin in the sands of Palestine, and the king who had returned from captivity to reclaim his domains, had finally found the death that seemed appropriate to a life lived at the extremes of human experience. In the quiet chambers where great kings draw their final breath, surrounded by the soft light of candles and the gentle voices of those who had loved him best, Richard the Lionheart passed from history into legend, leaving behind a story that would be told around hearth fires and in royal courts for as long as men remembered the age when knights sought glory in distant lands and honour was worth more than life itself. The final chapter of the Lionheart's tale had been written in blood on the walls of an obscure castle, but the legend that would grow from that ending would prove more enduring than any of the kingdoms he had ruled or the battles he had won. In death, as in life, Richard had achieved something that escaped most mortals. He had become immortal in the only way that truly matters, living on in the dreams and stories of generations yet unborn. As the bells tolled across the countryside of medieval Europe on that April evening in 1199, marking the passage of Richard the Lionheart from life into legend, few could have imagined how completely his story would capture the imagination of future generations. The king, who had died from a crossbow bolt at an insignificant siege, would achieve in death the kind of immortality that had eluded him in life, not through the conquest of Jerusalem, which had remained forever beyond his grasp, but through the conquest of human imagination, which would prove far more lasting than any military victory. The immediate aftermath of Richard's death saw the fragmentation of the vast Plantagenet empire that Henry II had so carefully constructed, and that Richard had defended with such tenacity. John Lackland's succession to the English throne marked the beginning of a new and less glorious chapter in Plantagenet history, while the continental domains fell piece by piece to Philip Augustus and his successors, until eventually only Gascony remained of the once mighty Angevin inheritance. But even as the political legacy of Richard's reign dissolved into the shifting patterns of medieval warfare and diplomacy, his personal legend began to grow with a life of its own. The troubadours who had sung his praises during his lifetime now composed laments for his passing that spread throughout the courts of Europe, while chroniclers competed to record the most memorable stories of his exploits for the instruction and entertainment of future generations. Within decades of his death, Richard had become the archetypal crusading knight, the model against which all future warriors would be measured and found wanting. The historical Richard, the complex political figure who had balanced the demands of multiple kingdoms while conducting sophisticated diplomatic negotiations with both Christian and Muslim rulers, gradually gave way to the legendary Richard, the perfect knight whose devotion to the crusading ideal had made him the greatest hero of his age. The transformation of Richard from historical figure to literary archetype was aided by the fundamental changes that were taking place in Europe's society during the decades following his death. The age of the great crusading expeditions was drawing to a close, replaced by more localized conflicts and the growing power of centralized monarchies. In this new world, Richard's combination of personal charisma and military genius seemed to represent the last flowering of a more heroic age, when individual excellence could still determine the fate of kingdoms. The matter of Britain, the great cycle of Arthurian romances that dominated medieval literature, provided a template for understanding Richard's career that emphasized its legendary rather than its historical aspects. Like Arthur himself, Richard came to be seen as a king whose reign had represented a golden age of chivalric values, a time when knights had been motivated by the highest ideals and when honor had been more precious than life itself. The crusading movement itself, as it evolved in the centuries following Richard's death, increasingly looked back to his campaigns as the standard by which all subsequent expeditions should be measured. Later crusaders who failed to achieve the kind of spectacular victories that had marked Richard's career were often criticized for lacking the Lionheart's combination of strategic vision and personal courage, while successful operations were praised by comparing them to Richard's triumphs at Acre and Arsuf. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Richard's posthumous reputation was the way it transcended the religious and cultural boundaries that had defined medieval conflict during his lifetime. Muslim chroniclers and poets who had fought against Richard and witnessed his military genius firsthand contributed their own stories to the growing legend, often portraying him with the kind of respect and admiration that was rarely accorded to Christian enemies. Saladin's reported tribute to Richard as the greatest warrior of the age became one of the most frequently cited testimonials to the English king's prowess, while later Muslim writers often used Richard as the standard by which they measured the courage and skill of their own heroes. This cross-cultural recognition of Richard's excellence helped to establish his reputation as a figure who transcended the particular conflicts of his own era to become a universal symbol of martial prowess and chivalric honor. The popular ballads and folk tales that began to circulate throughout Europe in the generations following Richard's death often took considerable liberties with historical accuracy in favor of dramatic effect and moral instruction. The Richard of these stories was a king who unfailingly defended the innocent, who showed mercy to his enemies, and who never allowed personal interest to compromise his dedication to justice and honor. These popular versions of the Richard legend often emphasized episodes that revealed the king's common touch and his connection to the ordinary people of his realm. Stories of Richard traveling in disguise among his subjects, of his encounters with Robin Hood and other folk heroes, and of his generosity toward those who served him faithfully, became staples of medieval popular culture and helped to establish his reputation as a king who, despite his royal birth and legendary status, remained fundamentally accessible to common people. The artistic representations of Richard that appeared in medieval manuscripts, church sculptures, and other visual media reflected the evolution of his legend from historical figure to archetypal hero. Early depictions often emphasized his role as a crusading king, showing him in the midst of battle against Muslim opponents or receiving the blessing of clergy for his holy endeavours. Later artistic treatments increasingly focused on his personal qualities, his courage, his magnanimity, and his dedication to the chivalric ideal. The architectural legacy of Richard's reign also contributed to the growth of his legend. The great fortress of Château Gaillard, which he had constructed in Normandy during the final years of his life, became a monument to his strategic genius and his determination to defend his domains against all enemies. Even after the castle had fallen to French forces and lost its military significance, it remained a powerful symbol of Richard's vision and ambition. The religious dimensions of Richard's legend were equally important in establishing his lasting reputation. His participation in the Third Crusade was seen as evidence of his deep piety and his willingness to sacrifice personal interests for the greater glory of Christendom. The fact that he had died during Lent, the holiest season of the Christian calendar, was interpreted by some as a sign of divine favour, while his final act of mercy toward the crossbowman who had killed him was seen as proof of his Christ-like forgiveness of his enemies. The scholarly tradition that developed around Richard's career in the later medieval period helped to preserve and systematize the various stories and traditions that had grown up around his name. University-trained historians and chroniclers attempted to separate fact from fiction in the Richard legend, but even their more critical approaches often served to reinforce his reputation by demonstrating the historical basis for many of the most celebrated stories about his exploits. The legal and administrative innovations that Richard had introduced during his reign, while less dramatic than his military victories, also contributed to his posthumous reputation as an effective ruler. The development of more sophisticated financial systems to fund his crusading activities, the establishment of more efficient methods for governing his diverse domains, and the creation of diplomatic networks that spanned Europe and the Middle East all testified to Richard's abilities as a statesman as well as a warrior. As the medieval period gave way to the Renaissance and the early modern era, Richard's legend continued to evolve and adapt to changing cultural values and artistic sensibilities. Renaissance writers and artists, inspired by classical models of heroism, often emphasized Richard's individual excellence and his achievement of immortal fame through great deeds. The emergence of national literatures in the vernacular languages of Europe ensured that Richard's story would be retold in new forms for new audiences. The invention of printing in the 15th century gave Richard's legend an even wider circulation, as popular books and pamphlets carried his story to audiences who had never had access to the manuscript traditions of medieval courts and monasteries. These printed versions of the Richard legend often emphasized the most dramatic and romantic aspects of his career, helping to establish the template for the adventure stories and historical novels that would continue to feature Richard as a central character well into the modern era. The Protestant Reformation of the 16th century might have been expected to diminish Richard's reputation, given his close association with the Catholic Church and the crusading movement. But Protestant writers often found ways to reinterpret Richard's career in terms that emphasized his resistance to papal authority and his dedication to English national interests, allowing his legend to survive and even flourish in the new religious environment. The emergence of the modern historical profession in the 18th and 19th centuries brought new critical approaches to the study of Richard's career. But even scholarly historians found it difficult to separate the historical king from the legendary hero. The Romantic movement of the 19th century, with its emphasis on individual genius and dramatic historical episodes, proved particularly receptive to Richard's story, inspiring novels, poems, and historical works that helped to establish his reputation in the modern world. The 20th century saw Richard's legend adapted for new media, films, radio programs, and eventually television, that brought his story to global audiences and ensured that his name would remain familiar to people who had never heard of most medieval kings. These modern retellings often emphasize different aspects of Richard's character and career, reflecting contemporary values and interests, but they maintain the essential elements that had made him legendary in the first place. As we move deeper into the 21st century, Richard the Lionheart remains one of the most recognizable figures from the medieval past, his name synonymous with courage, adventure, and the romantic ideals of chivalric knighthood. The historical Richard, the complex political figure who balanced competing interests while conducting military campaigns across 2 continents, may be less familiar to modern audiences than the legendary Richard of popular culture. But both versions continue to inspire and fascinate new generations of readers and viewers. The ultimate measure of Richard's achievement may not be found in the territories he conquered or the battles he won, but in the stories that continue to be told about him more than 8 centuries after his death. In an age when most medieval kings are remembered only by professional historians, Richard the Lionheart remains a living presence in popular culture, a reminder of an age when individual heroism could change the course of history, and when the pursuit of honor and glory seemed worth any sacrifice. As you drift peacefully toward sleep, carried by these gentle tales of knights and crusades, of distant lands and great adventures, remember that the greatest victory any of us can achieve is to live a life worthy of being remembered. Richard Plantagenet, called the Lionheart, achieved that immortality not through the cities he conquered or the kingdoms he ruled, but through the legend he became. A legend that continues to inspire and enchant us as we surrender to the peaceful embrace of sleep and dreams. Sweet dreams, dear listener, and may your own adventures, whether in waking life or in the realm of peaceful slumber, be worthy of the songs that future generations might sing.